Good morning and welcome to the NSERC Discovery Grants and RTI workshop. My name is Ron Borowski. I'm the NSERC lead for the university. I've served in the past as an evaluation group member as well in Biological Systems and Functions 1502, as well as a co-chair there. And joining me and helping to present is Lisa Jadagaonkar.
Hi.
I'm still learning how to pronounce this name. Lisa's done an awesome job of preparing some new slides for this year that give examples, very concrete examples from grants that have been prepared by U of S faculty, and she's gotten permission from them to share some of these examples. Also joining us today, special treat, we have two program officers from NSERC in Ottawa, Carolyn Bicker, if I can get you to give a wave. Carolyn is program officer with Materials and Chemical Engineering, EG 1511, and Kim Bonet is a program officer, Subatomic Physics. So I'll quickly introduce our panel here as well. Do you have the clicker?
I'm going to grab it from over here.
I've got the wrong clicker. Okay, and our panel of evaluation group and RTI members, these are all people who have served very recently or currently on an evaluation group or an RTI group in Ottawa. I'll just get them to wave as I introduce them. We have Ildiko Badea, who is a RTI Engineering Committee member. We have Ian Burgess, who I don't think is quite here yet. Ian's RTI Chemistry Committee member. We have Jack Gray, who is a former member of 1501, Gene, Cells, and Molecules, and 1502, as well as former co-chair of 1502. We have Lisa Kalinchuk, who is a current evaluation group member for 1502. Pat Crone, who is a chair of the RTI Gene, Cells, and Molecules Committee. He's also a former member and co-chair of EG 1501. We have Regan Mandrick, I'm still learning how to pronounce her name, who's a current member of Evaluation Group 1507, Computer Science. Daniel McPhee, who's a current member of EG 1501. Adil Nazarali, who's a current member of EG 1501. And Kerry Simonson, I believe is here, yes. He is a co-chair of EG 1512, Mechanical Engineering. And Yan Zhao, who is a member of 1501. So we'll be turning to these folks after we get through our set of slides for them to add any additional tips and strategies that they would like to share with you, sort of a couple minutes for each panel member. And then we're opening it up to a Q&A for all of the audience to ask questions. I will note that we're going to have to pass a microphone to you to ask your question so that we can, one, have it be part of the recording for this session. Just a reminder, you are being video recorded and audio recorded today, just the same as we did last year. But also for our friends in Ottawa to be able to hear your question, and they might also chime in on some of the responses. It's something I want to say that the panel has our local expertise. These are U of S faculty who've served on these committees in Ottawa, and they've brought back some incredible knowledge of how to prepare a grant for success. The program officers, these are folks that we work with on these committees in Ottawa. They are the institutional memory for NSERC, if you will. They are at every table for deliberation on your grants in their respective evaluation groups. And so they have incredible sense of how things are working currently, how consistency is sort of achieved across various evaluation groups as well. Okay, so we might as well go and get started. I think I turn over to you now.
Sure, yeah, so just a quick overview. So we'll start this morning by talking about the NSERC Discovery Grant evaluation process and some strategies to prepare your application. And then we will go to a Q&A session with our panel members here. Afterwards, we'll take a quick break and break out into different evaluation groups. So it'll give an opportunity to discuss strategies that might be more related to your specific evaluation group. And then just before lunch, we'll head over to Marquis Hall for a celebration lunch and an opportunity to continue networking. A couple of quick announcements. All of the information today is supplementary to the NSERC instructions, so make sure you do go on to the NSERC Discovery Grant website and take a look at the instructions for that. Video and slides and any documents that we refer to today will be available on the Research Services website. And as well, NSERC has many resources to guide you in your preparation of the NSERC Discovery Grant. And we will have a listing of all of those resources at the very end of our presentation, so you can go and collect more. So before we get started, I'll also mention to you about the NSERC Discovery Grant timelines for the University of Saskatchewan. I've handed out a copy of the NSERC Discovery Grant timeline. On one side, it talks about the Discovery Grant timelines. On the other side, it's the instructions and timelines for the research tools and instruments. A couple of key dates to note here. The first major deadline is coming up for August 1st, which is when the NSERC notification of intent is due. You'll notice that there's a little notice there that in Saskatchewan, we have a holiday on August 1st, which means the U of S will be closed on that day. So U of S is recommending that you send in your notification of intent a few days earlier by July 29th. That way, if you run into any problems, there's someone there who will be able to help you with that. Now, along with your NOI, you will also need to submit your CCV. If you don't have a CCV prepared, don't worry too much, because in June, John Watts, who is sitting over there, if you want to give a wave, runs some excellent workshops on how to get your CCV done and how to interact with the research portal. So consider attending one of these workshops, and you'll be in good shape with your CCV and ready for the research portal. The other important dates is October 25th is the Research Services deadline for having your application in to the University for institutional signature. Keep in mind that your college or your department might have a deadline date that's earlier than that. In arts and science, it's usually due about 1 week earlier. And November 1st is when you submit to NSERC. And we're hoping that everyone will consider participating in our internal review at the university here. And the deadlines for that is May 31st, asking for a notification, quick notification that you're interested in participating in the internal review process. The day after you submit your official notification of intent, or a couple days later, it will give an opportunity to talk about, you submit a copy of that notification of intent, and then we'd ask for a draft by September 1st, and you should be getting feedback by September 22nd, which gives you about a month or so to input all the information before the Research Services deadline.
I hope you can hear me. Is that better? There. We've moved the timeline up a bit this year. Getting the request for internal review, that notification, done so much earlier this year, what it'll do is it asks you on that form to list up to 3 faculty who you would like to have as your suggested internal reviewers. By indicating your interest in having those folks be your internal reviewers, that allows us to begin email communication with them, to encourage them to be one of your reviewers, and for you to start a dialogue with them right away. So that you can, instead of waiting until you have a draft of your proposal ready, you can go grab a coffee and have a discussion about various strategies, various programs of research that you're thinking about including in your NSERC Discovery Grant application, and for them to provide you some feedback on those ideas as early in this process as possible. So that was the main change this year, was moving up that intent for internal review to be a lot earlier. The other thing I'll mention is we did, as a matter of course, last year also send the grants to the research facilitators in the college that you're in. So those of you who've been through this process before realize how valuable that feedback is as well. The research facilitators have had a lot of experience reading and editing grants and giving a sort of general scientist perspective on its readability. So again, please do consider participating in internal review. We'll show some stats at the end of the slide set that showed what the benefit was this past year.
Okay, Ron.
Okay, so in starting your grant writing process, one of the things that I would highly recommend is that you print off a copy of this Discovery Grant rating form. When your grant is being adjudicated in Ottawa, 5 members of an evaluation group are sitting around a table, and they've all read your grant with this in mind. So they've been scoring it on the basis of the headings and subheadings that you see here. Hopefully this will show. So for example, excellence of the researcher. They are giving a score from hopefully as high as exceptional and nowhere near as low as insufficient, that's a 6-point scale, on things like knowledge, expertise, and experience, quality of contributions to and impact on the proposed and other areas of research in the natural sciences and engineering, and the importance of contributions to and use by other research and end users. So when you're working on your proposal and your statement of your contributions to research, etc., you want to keep in mind these subheadings and that you're being scored on them. Under merit of the proposal, the subheadings include originality and innovation, significance and expected contributions to research, clarity and scope of objectives. This is a really important one. Clarity and appropriateness of methodology, feasibility, discussion of relevant issues, appropriateness and justification of the budget, and explanation of the relationship to other sources of funds. The last category here is contributions to the training of highly qualified personnel, or if you're new to the NSERC world, we usually refer to this as HQP. We're looking, it's worth a third. All of these are worth a third of the grant score. In this case for HQP, half of that third is based on quality and impact of past contributions to training of HQP. The other half is based on the appropriateness and clarity of the proposal for the training of your future HQP. Also, if applicable, any training and collaborative and interdisciplinary environment. So all of these things are important factors. The way in which you should keep these in mind is related to what are called the merit indicators, which is yet another sheet that Lisa has passed around. And if you can set to the next slide, you should have this printed off as well. So if you have the rating sheet and the merit indicators in front of you while you're working on your grant, you will have in front of you what the people who are scoring your grant have in front of them. And I think that's an excellent way to kind of engage in this grant writing process. A couple things to highlight on that merit form. The merit indicators, if you think of strong being the threshold for getting a grant, and indeed, if you're an established researcher who has not held an NSERC grant before, you will need to score an average of strong in these 3 categories in order to get a grant. The exception to this is early career researchers. If you're within your first 2 years of your first hire as a faculty member, you may have, let's say, a score of moderate on the HQP. You will still be able to get a grant. But let's treat strong across the board then as a threshold that you're shooting for and that you really do want to aim above that when you're preparing your grant. So under things like excellence of the researcher, you'll notice that I've highlighted things like what's been presented as accomplishments are deemed to be solid in quality, impact, or importance. To get a score of very strong, basically they're looking for evidence for superior. And next up is far superior. So we'll talk about tips and strategies and give some examples today for how you might actually position your description involving excellence of the researcher to do better on that score. Under merit of the proposal, you'll notice things like original and innovative, likely to have impact. That's the strong category. To get to very strong, you'll note things like likely to have impact by leading to advancements. And one more up to outstanding would be likely to have impact by contributing to groundbreaking advances. Some of these descriptors are things that you want to try to hit. Maybe don't be overly obvious in saying everything you've done has led to groundbreaking advances, but perhaps you can write in a way that describes your work as having some of those groundbreaking advances. The next piece in the merit of the proposal has to do with the long-term and short-term long-term goals and short-term objectives. These are clearly described in one that's getting rated as strong. To get up to very strong, you'll note words like defined. The long-term goals are defined and the short-term objectives are planned. Okay, so right away you have to think of, well, what is your long-term objective or your long-term goal? Things like, are you developing a model of the basic mechanism of something? If that's the case, state it, that that is your long-term goal, that that's what you're working on through your career. Within your 5-year NSERC grant, Discovery Grant proposal, you are describing quite a few short-term objectives, experiments and studies that are leading towards your long-term goal. So please keep in mind that how well you define that and how clearly you explicate those objectives impacts your score here. In the outstanding category, you'll note these goals are clearly defined in terms of the long-term ones, and the short-term objectives are well planned. So these are the kinds of things you want to pay attention to. Finally, on HQP, for strong, you should be having a record that compares favorably with others. The HQP are generally moving on to positions that require these skill sets. To get to the very strong, one would want to be rated as superior in terms of their training record, and that many of their HQP are moving on into the desired positions for their skill sets, and into the outstanding, we have a record that's far superior, and that most of those HQP are moving on. So we've just highlighted some of these things for you to sort of pay attention to. As we go through the slide set today, we'll return to some of these and sort of hopefully underscore what techniques and strategies you can employ. After we have gotten through the slide set, I think some of our panel members will also have some extra tips and strategies to add to that as well. Okay, Lisa, go ahead. So in general, you're going to need to argue a few things here. One, that you are an excellent researcher regarding your accomplishments and your impact, and that is going to reflect on your excellence of the researcher score. You're going to need a strong, hopefully very strong or outstanding even, proposal, innovative, clear objectives, clear methodology, feasible discussion of issues, and written in plain language. The 5 people that are around the table adjudicating your grant, there may not be anyone with your expertise in your area. So you have to write in plain language that any general scientist can understand. And third, you'll have to provide strong training in terms of explaining your pedagogy for your past training and your future training. Okay, next. Okay. So today, we're going to cover not all of the Discovery Grant proposal sections. The ones that are highlighted in green are the ones that we're going to focus on. If you like, please take a look at the slide set from last year. They contain information on all these topics. And we'll also be mentioning at the end of this presentation that NSERC is holding webinars in the coming months where they're going to go through their standard set of slides as well on these various topics. Today, we're going to focus on mainly the HQP training plan, the past contributions to HQP training, the most significant contributions section, and the proposal. I'll just briefly mention the summary at this stage, and then I'm going to turn it over to Lisa. In the public summary, one, I'd suggest you leave it until the end of your writing, but two, don't just treat it as a public summary that no one's going to read it except the public. I think I can say it is the case for most evaluation group members that they take a look at that before they even look at the proposal. Use it to your advantage. Use that public summary space in a way where you can set the framework, set the context for your grant. Make it as accessible and as in plain language as possible, and use it to your advantage to help set the stage for your proposal. Okay, Lisa.
So we'll start off by talking about the HQP training plan, which of course speaks to the merit criteria of HQP training. And there's 3 important things that you'll need to do in this section. First of all, and it might seem really obvious at first, but a lot of people forget to do this, you need to talk about what your students are going to do. What parts of your research are they going to undertake? What will your master's students do? What will your PhD students? And it's very important that this relate back to your actual research program and research proposal that you are presenting. So one of the easiest ways to do this is to relate it to a research objective. So for example, you might say, I'll have 2 master's students working on objective 1. The first master's students will look after this. The second one will look after this. In doing so, you also want to differentiate why you might have a PhD student looking at something and why you might have a master's student looking at something. Give an idea for the scale of the project or what makes one more of a PhD level project versus a master's level project. So the third thing you would want to do is you want to make sure that you're showing what your students will learn. Remember that this is a training plan, right? So your students are going to learn special skills that should benefit them in their future careers. So you want to outline what skills it is that they're learning. Now, especially any skills that are in high demand, any skills which are new and emerging, any skills which, say, combine different disciplines into something unique, make sure you stress those so that your evaluator understands that your students are really getting a good benefit and opportunity to learn about something. Finally, again, need to mention that your students are going to publish and present. Now, this is, again, one of those things where it seems really obvious, but you need to be very explicit. And this word explicit, I'm going to mention it over and over again because it's very important to show and demonstrate yourself in your application that this is what you're going to be doing. So make sure you indicate that students are going to be encouraged to publish and present as applicable, right? Then you can also add in the value add. Do your students get to access special facilities? Do you have special poster days or special presentation days within your college that might be of value? Do you work with an industrial collaborator? Will your student get a chance to find out how things might work at a mine site or in the field? Make sure you talk about all these value-added opportunities to distinguish your program. Also, if you are looking to fund undergraduates in your research program, make sure you talk about all these things for your undergrads too. What will your undergrads learn? Maybe if they might not be there for very long, but maybe they'll learn how to use some instrumentation, or maybe they'll understand some special field skills. So make sure you're incorporating that too. And the other thing I'll mention is that the emphasis is on benefits to the students. So when you talk about your training plan, instead of wording which says, I expect my students to publish by the end of year one, you might want to use words that show that you're contributing and helping them to be able to publish in year one or year two, or how it might be. So remember, you're writing it from the perspective of benefiting the student. So let me show you an example here. And this example was provided by David Jantz in the Department of Veterinary Biomedical Sciences. And you can see that he starts off by directly involving his students, relating it to his objective 2. So he says 2 MSc students will be involved with objective 2, and then he puts in brackets and gives you a little description of what's going on in objective 2, a little reminder as you're reading it. Then he indicates what the students are going to accomplish. So one of these students, one that's going to be recruited, is going to look at early life stage zebrafish. The other student is going to look at something complementary. He's going to look at juvenile rainbow trout. And it gives a sense that, yeah, 2 master's students can take on this objective, right? That you have one that needs to look at the zebrafish, one that needs to look at the trout. These experiments are complementary. And so it gives you a really good sense of what the students are going to be doing in the lab. In this paragraph, he also names his students where applicable. I have taken out all student names for these slides, but as you go through, you'll see that people, where possible, name students. Now, in order for privacy regulations, there's a form that your students are required to fill out to say that they give permission for you to share their name. But if you can do that, it's great to show that connection with your student by naming them where possible. And I'll also point out that David Jantz does also talk about what his undergraduate students will do, and that they'll be recruited to study rainbow trout, and they come in years 3 to 5 of the research. Shahid Khan in the Department of Math and Stats provided this example where he talks about what will the students learn. Now, this is about the skills that the students learn. You've talked about what they'll do, talking about what they will actually learn. And so he notes some of the skills that they'll learn. They're going to learn about formulating statistical models. They're going to learn about computer algorithms and developing statistical packages. And he also notes how this will benefit them in their future careers. And he notes, too, that this will be with input from him provided at regularly scheduled meetings. Show your interactions to show that it actually is a training. Again, you don't want wording like students will be expected to prepare statistical packages. They're coming to you to learn, and you want to show that in your application. So the next section that relates to the HQP criteria is your past HQP. Who have you trained, and how successful have you been with training these students? So you're almost going to do everything the same like you did for your HQP training planning, but looking retrospectively. So what skills have your students learned? How has it helped them in their careers? Now remember, non-academic career paths are good too. If they have gone on into consulting, if they work for government, all of these skills are really important, and if they're using the skills that they've learned in the lab, that is very valuable. Sometimes too, students will learn skills and they won't stay in quite the same discipline. They might go on and do a PhD in a slightly different topic, but they might use some of those transferable skills in their current careers. Field skills, analytical skills, instrumentation skills. So if you know someone's in a different career, but they are still using some of the things that you've taught them, be sure to mention that as well too. Again, don't forget to mention that your students have published and presented at conferences. If they've won awards, you might want to indicate that too. And I know a lot of this information, right, it's in your CCV, it'll be indicated there. But I think when an evaluator is trying to find out about what information you provided on training, the first place they're going to look is in the HQP section. And so it's best if you're really explicit there. Again, don't forget to talk about your undergraduate students. What skills did they learn? And then again, how did you interact with those students? What is it that you did with your students that helped them to pick up these skills? So an example here, and this one was provided by Sasha Kustov in the Department of Physics and Engineering Physics. And he starts off by talking about publications. And you'll notice he talks about the publications in aggregate. He doesn't have to list each student and the number of publications that they have. He makes some general comments. He says, my MSc students contributed to my research in a significant way, which is great. It shows that tie into his research program. He says, everyone is a co-author or even a lead author on one of my refereed publications. But he kind of puts it in aggregate for the conference presentations and says, over the last 6 years, my graduate students have made 10 conference presentations, either in person or contributed to one of theirs. So it gives a sense of their accomplishments, and a reviewer who wants to see exactly what the students have contributed can then refer to the CCV. He specifically mentions the skills that they're learning, and these are quite general and important skills, right? Software development, data visualization, physical concept testing, and some soft skills too, like networking. Sometimes people talk about writing skills being really important. And then he talks about careers and notes that these skills enable him to be successful in their further careers. And he names some of his students, again, remembering to use their actual names where possible. One who is working quite closely in the field by working for government, for NRCan. He mentions some students have gone on in academia, and he also says some have used some of that statistical training that he provides to go on and work at the Canadian Light Source. So again, gives a nice, well-rounded series of examples of how his students have progressed on with their careers with the training that he has provided. I wanted to make a quick mention of past HQP for new faculty, because a lot of times new faculty who are starting will not have had a lot of students, not have had an opportunity to supervise a lot of students. Now, in many ways, this is taken into consideration by NSERC, and maybe we'll have a little bit more of a discussion about that. But I did want to provide an example from a new faculty member who, while she was a postdoc, took students under her wing and mentored them. And she wanted a way to be able to incorporate that because it shows that she's very interested and very committed to HQP training. And so she did that with this paragraph. She did describe the students that she had previously. And she's very clear that she did not supervise these students. She mentions, in fact, twice in this paragraph that she did not officially supervise these students. She was not eligible to be the student supervisor. But then she does say what it is that she actually did do with the students, that she has expertise in sedimentary geochemistry, and that allowed her to provide effective mentorship. And then she goes on to describe the mentorship that she provided to these students. If you are in a similar situation where there are students that you kind of took under your wing when you were a postdoc and you'd like to mention it, this might be one way of doing that. But be specific as to what it is that you did. It's just not that you were there in the lab and so were these other students. You want to say what it is that you did. Did you supervise them in the field? Were you the person who trained them on a particular type of instrumentation? Be specific as to what it is that you actually, to show that you actually did contribute to the training. And I'll be curious actually too to hear from some of the panelists on this about different approaches for new faculty. Now you'll notice with all of the examples I presented that everyone is quite descriptive, right? There is not just a list of names, thesis title, and graduation year. It's important, I think, to be descriptive in these sections, to present it in the form of a narrative, because it shows the value of your training and it shows how the students can benefit. The name, rank, serial number, it doesn't really give a sense of the type of interest and commitment that you have to training your students. Now, one example that we can look at here is a lot of times people will put, when they're describing the interactions with their students, they'll say, well, we met weekly. But we met weekly doesn't really mean a whole lot. I meet weekly probably with Jack and with Ron, but that doesn't really give you a sense of what we talk about, what we do. So for things like that, be as descriptive as you can. I mean, maybe your meetings are all about troubleshooting. Maybe it's really formal and rigid and the students stand up and have to give their presentation as to what they're accomplished. Or maybe you guys are really creative and you brainstorm and it's very active. All good things. Describe what it is that you do. Now, Ron has provided this example to us. And he says, we work together and talk through what we're doing. They look at choice of experimental designs. They talk about analytical strategies and a choice of wording while writing papers. Gives you a really good sense that he is not just present at the meeting, he is actually engaged in training the students and giving them an opportunity to improve themselves. And I did want to mention too, because there's many different ways of training students, many different approaches that you can take. And there is no right or wrong answer, I think, in describing your training program for students. And in this table, I've almost deliberately picked some opposite ends of the spectrum. I mean, you might be the type of person who discusses frequently with students. You're always there, you're always in the lab, you're always available. Or you might say, you know, I really want my students to be independent. It's important that they're able to be independent out in the field, so you know, I try to encourage that. You might let your students benefit from access to some fancy equipment, or you might be more of a back to basics person. You better learn how to do this, you know, and learn the basics and the principles behind it before you progress on to using some kits or something more advanced. Maybe your meetings are all really creative, or maybe you're just, you know, let's get the operational stuff done, and then you can, then you have the rest of the week. It doesn't really matter what your approach is. All of these show that you're interacting with your students and that you care about your students. And so by adding details as to what it is that you do, you're showing that you are there to provide an effective HQP training program. One last thing I'll mention about HQP is if you're proposing to train a lot of students, in your HQP section, you have a very short space to describe what's happening with your students. And so if you want to show how many students that you'll have over the years and where they fit into your research program, one way you could do this is with a table. And I provided two examples here. And in the top table, which was provided by Jack, he puts the years across the top, and then he uses MSc, PhD to indicate the students and some shading to indicate what years that they'll be working on his research program. And the H1A and HB refer to his hypotheses, so you might want to link it to your objectives if you don't have a hypothesis. But gives a good sense of where everyone fits into the research program, and so you can save yourself some text rather than having to write MSc1 will be years 1 to 2 and MSc2 will be years 3 to 4. You can't put these tables into that narrative description in past HQP and future HQP training, but you can, however, put these tables into your budget justifications section. The budget justification section allows 2 pages, and usually people have a bit of room, and you can put it in the section where you talk about your funding for your HQP. The second table is very similar, just a different format. The names of the students or the level of the students is in the left-hand column, the objectives are in the next one, and then X's are used to indicate what years the students will be there. Sometimes people annotate the table, so if your student was previously funded with an ADF, you might put ADF in brackets, or you might put a little asterisk and then provide a little bit more information if they're getting scholarships in certain years or something like that. So it's a really quick way to summarize all of the information and save yourself a little bit of space while writing. So I think that takes me to the end of the HQP section. Ron, do you want to add?
Sure. I think just to underscore a couple things that Lisa's mentioned. One, all HQP count. So think broadly about this. There are lots of schools in Canada that have only undergraduate programs, and those people have the same chance of getting high scores on their HQP section as do you. So it could be postdocs, PhDs, masters, undergraduate honors students, could be undergraduate research volunteers. In fact, for those of you who might be applying again this fall and had a low score on HQP this last time around, there's quite a bit that you can do this summer if you're able to recruit some undergraduate volunteers into your lab and give them some projects to work on. They count. They all count. The other thing is, as Lisa was saying, make it personal. Do get their permission. Get their permission to use their names. If you can imagine a table of 5 scientists deliberating on your HQP section, if they have a sense that this is a good environment, you know your students by their names. You know where they went on to after they finished working with you, and you're proud of all of that, that bodes well. That provides a sense of an environment that they'd want to send their children to your lab to be trained as a scientist. So that's the kind of strategy that I really recommend. All right, go ahead.
Okay. So the next section we'll look at is significant contributions, and this relates quite strongly to the Excellence of Researcher merit category. So when you read the NSERC instructions, it will say that you can list up to 5 significant contributions from the last 6 years. Now, what this does not mean is that you can only list 5 papers. In fact, we encourage you to bring in as many papers and outputs as you possibly can by clustering these papers together and other outputs together as a single contribution. So this allows you to do a couple things. It allows you to introduce a few different academic papers. It allows you to tie in other outputs. If you have technical reports, if you had media coverage, you can bring in those outputs as evidence of your contribution as well. And if you have had a significant contribution that is outside of those 6 years limits, but it's something that you're still working on today, you're extending findings from a paper from year 2000, and you've been working on it quite a bit, you can mention that really important paper, that seminal paper, as part of this cluster, as long as you are still extending that knowledge and contributing to that research area today. So for each cluster, what you would want to do is give it a title so that it identifies what the contribution area is. And you want to describe briefly what was found. Then you want to describe the implications. And this is important because when you look at excellence of researcher merit criteria, it says things like were your accomplishments influential? Did they appeal to a broad community? So make sure you're describing the implications. And those might be the implications directly in your field. They might be implications to another discipline. It might be implications much more broadly. So make sure you're describing who it's influencing and how. Describe who it's important to. It might be immediately important to the people that are right in your field. But it might also be very important to someone in another field. Remember, one of the criteria there is it talks about broad influence and accomplishments of broad influence. So you want to make sure that you are talking about to all the constituencies that are affected by your discovery. And in some cases, it might be really, really influential in your particular field, but also tangentially important in another field. So make sure you're describing all the people who are affected by this. And also look at novelty in your approach, too. If there's something novel that you're doing that no one else has done, if you've had a new way of looking at things, make sure you incorporate that, too.
I can just jump in for one sec, Lisa. So another way to think about a cluster is you might very well describe it as one of your programs of research, and that it might be a program of research that goes well beyond the 6-year review period. As you're demonstrating impact, one of the things you might be doing is indicating how often various papers are getting cited. And we all know that if you go back further than 6 years, that work tends to have gotten cited more often. So if you're able to describe a cluster, as Lisa's indicated, as a program of research, this justifies you pointing backwards in time to some of these earlier papers to demonstrate this ongoing impact that you've had. And being able to, reach back to an article you may have published while you were still a postdoc or a doctoral student is probably going to allow you to point to some high number of citations. On this topic, because this might come up anyways, things like, I get asked this often, should I include my H-index? This is up to you as an applicant. You might want to check with your colleagues about whether you think that's a good competitive H-index to include. The rule with NSERC is the members around the table are not going to, or nor are they allowed to bring any information to the table that's not in the grant. So if you put H-index in there, indeed, they will talk about it. But if you don't, they're not to be bringing it up on their own. So it's really under your control. I do think that at least pointing to how often some of your work has been cited can be quite helpful, and the issue of H-index is entirely up to you.
Thanks, Ron. So let's look at an example here. This is an example that was provided by Rob Scott in the Department of Chemistry. Don't need to worry too much about all the text that is in here, but there's a couple things that I can highlight for it. So the first thing to note about it is that this is one contribution out of the 5 contributions that you can have. And you'll notice right at the very top that he has clustered together about 6 or 7 publications and a couple of keynote presentations. He also refers, if you see the underlined parts over here and over here, he also refers specifically to some of the papers in the narrative of the text. Then he describes what was actually found. He says that they've showed that the templating approach is an excellent route to the synthesis of chemically and structurally well-defined I won't go into the details there. And he's also shown that catalytic activity is influenced not only by bimetallic compositions, but also by structures. And I'll let you read, read on in that. Then he describes the implications. He says that these bimetallic NPs are interesting because, and he also refers to particular users. So he talks about implications that he's spoken at a chemical engineering conference, so obviously implications in that field. And he has gone on to do an NSERC strategic collaboration, so obviously of interest to some company collaborators and some other universities in Canada here. Now, if you're still wondering about all the different items that you need to include in your significant contributions template, we have a fantastic resource. Jen Clark, who's with the College of Pharmacy and Nutrition, and John Watts, who's with the Department of Medicine, they're just over there. Thanks. Prepare this absolutely fantastic template and phrase bank for developing your significant contributions. And this is going to be available on the Research Services website. And on the left-hand column over here, it takes you through what was done, what was found, what was the implications. And on the back, it talks you through some evidence and possible outputs that you might want to bring into your significant contributions. And on this right-hand column here, it prompts you with different questions to consider and make sure that you've incorporated everything. And then if you're not sure how to word it, or if you find that you're using the same wording, advancing discoveries, or over and over again, they've also created a phrase bank, which gives you some wording to either inspire you or to use directly in writing your significant contribution section. So even if you've developed your significant contribution section already, take 5 minutes and definitely go through the template because I often find that there's something that gets missed, you know, a new approach or something that got forgotten about with the original draft of the significant contributions.
Okay, so just to wrap up then on the excellence of research merit indicators. So again, to get from solid to superior to far superior, you have to make a case. As Lisa was suggesting with the clustering, or as I was saying, calling these programs of research, one way, you know, to conceptualize the idea that NSERC is asking you for up to 5 contributions, you might decide, you know, really what I have are 2 programs of research or 3 programs of research that I can cluster papers together, and to describe those as these multiple programs of research. That does come across as quite impressive. So I want to underscore that's one way to bring your score up in this category. I think all the other pointers that Lisa made are excellent, and I think we'll just carry on here in sake of time and move on to the next one.
Okay, so the next part is the proposal, and this speaks to the merit of the proposal merit indicator. When you look at the NSERC instructions, they'll tell you that this is the 5-page proposal where they suggest that you address the following points. And these are recent progress, short and long-term objectives, literature review, methodology, and impact. And in most cases, I'd recommend, where possible, to use these topics as subheaders, so that it makes it really easy for the reviewer to find the information. If, for example, a reviewer wants to know, oh, what has the researcher done in the past in this area, they're going to probably look at your recent progress section. So make this information easy to find by using clear subheaders. Now, having said that, there is some flexibility with it. So, for example, if the methodology that you're proposing to do relies quite heavily on some that you've used in the past, it might make sense to combine some of these subtitles. So you might have a subheader that says recent progress and methodology. But if you use the subheaders, if you refer to those words, then at least someone knows where to go for that information. Another thing that's often done is, instead of just having one impact section, sometimes if you have 3 or 4 different objectives, someone might include the impact for each one of those objectives and then have a broader impact statement at the end. So do feel free to put them in different orders, to combine sections, but if you use that wording, then it just makes that information easy to find. The other tip in general for starting out with your proposal is make sure you're using direct sentences, especially if you're combining different headers together, like recent progress and methodology. If you have sentences that say, for example, these results can be extended to an understanding of, it's not clear, do you plan on extending them? Will someone else extend them? Have you already done this work? So use words like I, my lab, my group to indicate who is doing what. So going through each of these topics, the first one we'll look at is the objectives. And it's very important that you make sure that your short-term and long-term objectives are easy to find. If you look at the merit criteria, it says make sure that your short-term and long-term objectives are easy to find. So one way to do this is obviously to have a separate section for your objectives. And here, Yang Dao Wei in the Department of Biology, the bolding that he has done here is not mine. He has bolded his long-term goals and short-term goals, and each one of his 3 objectives makes it really stand out, makes it really easy to find. The other thing I'll mention about this is that your long-term goal describes your research program. It should encompass what you have done in the past, what you intend to do in the discovery, and what you'll probably be looking at in the future. It's your long-term vision for your program. It's not an application of your research. So Yang Dao does not say, for example, that his long-term goal is to feed the world. He says it is to be able to study and understand the molecular mechanisms underlying plant pathogen interactions. Gives you an idea of what he's done in the past, what he intends to do with the proposal, and going forward. And then his short-term goals define what he intends to do over the next 5 years with funding from the Discovery Grant. And he relates each one of these objectives to the long-term goals. They all fall under this to show that it is, in fact, a research program. NSERC Discovery funds research programs. It doesn't fund individual projects. And so it's important to show that cohesiveness between what you've done beforehand and where you're going with the research in the future. Sometimes people ask me if if you're in theoretical sciences and not in experimental sciences, do you still need to show objectives? And the answer is yes. Masoud Ghazelbash in Department of Physics and Engineering Physics, he looks at black holes, and he still articulated a long-term objective. It's to provide better support and contribute additional evidence in favor of holography for the rotating black holes. And then he describes what he's going to do over the next 5 years. And he talks about investigation, finding correlation functions, and some constructions. So he is also able to articulate some objectives for the next 5 years. Okay, so moving on in the proposal, in talking about the literature review, make sure you're citing recent works. So remember, you're trying to show feasibility and an awareness and understanding of what's happening around in your research area. So make sure that you show that you know that by providing this in the literature review. If it so happens that there is a lag, there has been no research done in this area for the last 10 years, be explicit about it. Make sure you mention that there's been a lag, and maybe explain why there was or why there's now a renewed interest in this area. That could be quite exciting too, right? If some new evidence comes up and new applicability. So make sure you include that. And in recent progress, cite your own work. here. Now, one of the things in the merit criteria that talks about it quite a bit is it's going to look at feasibility. Is your proposal feasible over the next 5 years? So if you can show that you have done some work in this area, then it's much more likely to be feasible that you will be able to continue this on in the next 5 years. If you have a contractor come to your house to do some renovations and they say, oh yeah, I've worked on roofs like this over the last few years, you're thinking, yeah, they could probably handle my one too, right? Now, methodology. If you look at any of the grants on the grants repository, you'll notice that the methodology section takes up quite a sizable portion of the proposal. It's a very important part. You have to give a lot of details. The methodology section is very dense and should include enough details so that the reviewers can determine whether or not it is feasible. Now, the other thing you want to add in your methodology section, which is a little bit different, is you also want to talk about proactively about any possible challenges that you might encounter or any alternate approaches, because this shows that you have thought through your methodology. So as you're thinking through your proposal and you think to yourself, oh, you know, I could do it this way or I could do it this way, and then you talk with your colleagues and you do a little bit more research and you're like, well, you know what? Plan B is probably the best way to go. Don't just talk about Plan B. Mention that you've also considered Plan A, but you know that it might not work for the following reasons, or that you've decided to start with Plan B for whatever reasons you chose. Be, again, explicit about that. So an example here, Chantal Roy in the Department of Computer Science, he's talking about doing some plugins, and he mentions, well, he's already developed Sim Eclipse, and so the extension of that work is much more likely to be feasible in upcoming years. These examples were from Jack Gray's proposal, and here he talks about, first of all, he talks about alternate possibilities. So suppose he did this work but didn't quite get the outcome he expected, so he says, these findings would suggest that the central coordinating mechanisms are required for collision avoidance. Alternatively, if he doesn't see that, lack of synchrony within or between a bilateral seat would suggest. And he goes on to say either result will provide information. And so showing different alternate possibilities if something doesn't quite, if the outcomes you intended might not appear, maybe talk about what the alternates would suggest. And then proactively discuss limitations. Jack uses the phrase, one caveat is that the behavioral responses may not reflect true free flight. But he says, nevertheless, the data is going to be relevant to understanding central coordination during production of behavior. So again, if you're in that situation where you have different alternates, it's best to include them and be proactive in discussing any limitations. And then finally is the impact section. Now, again, if you look at your merit criteria, you'll see that impact is a very important part of this criteria to be able to show that you've had a broad impact. When you're talking about impact, it can be on a wide variety of things. You might have impact on basic science. You might be addressing a controversial area of science, or inputting new information, or adding new information. You might be substantiating something. You might be extending your findings. So there's a wide variety of different things. You could also have impact on the development of technology, or maybe your impact is broader, and maybe it is on more society in general. You could talk about it from all these different perspectives. And depending upon what end of the spectrum you're on, from basic science to applied, you might give more emphasis on basic science, you might give more emphasis on technologies or industries. In doing your impact statement, also show who it is having an impact on, whether it's researchers in your discipline, researchers in another discipline. So for example, if you're doing some work in bioinformatics, it might be just as part of your objectives might be a little bit important in making advances in computer science, but wow, the folks who are doing the plant breeding are really going to benefit from this. So make sure you talk about your impact as a whole. And again, you can refer to that phrase bank that I mentioned, and that template is just, instead of describing what you have done, now you can use that template to help you make sure you consider all your areas of new impact. So I'll show you an example here. And I picked this example from Gap-Soo Chang in Department of Physics and Engineering Physics because he kind of goes from all ends of the the spectrum. And he starts out by talking about the impact on basic research as well as moves it on to technologies. So he says the research directions outlined in this proposal involve not only advancing our knowledge of 2D direct materials and their band structure engineering, but also promoting basic research to develop practical electronics and photovoltaic devices. He then goes on to talk about different benefits, and he's very specific about what kind of technologies benefit. It's not just that it will benefit technology and industry. He goes on to describe what technologies and what industries are impacted. One of the things you might notice is at the end here, he talks about the impact that it would have on ICT and energy technologies, but you'll notice that he takes it in a stepwise fashion from the basic research to the technologies to the industries. If he was to say, my research will revolutionize the energy industry, that there is no intermediate steps between his contribution and the final outcome. So make sure that you tie it together. Make sure you show that logical link between how you're getting from your research to that outcome at the end. And the other thing that he's done quite nicely is he's given a little bit of evidence that this is a priority area for Canada. If you have come across reports and that talk about the importance of understanding something, then make sure that you cite it in here because it adds credibility and evidence that you are in fact contributing and having impact.
Okay, and I'll make a pitch as well for including a figure or figures in your proposal when they're relevant. If you think of your proposal as really an attempt to tell a story of what it is you're planning to do, just as when you're writing a scientific article, you might have figures in there. It might be an architecture of a model, or it might be some complex data. This is extracted from my grant. Instead of trying to describe a bunch of brain regions that are involved in a particular condition, it was far easier for me to insert a figure. So I want to encourage you to think that way. It maybe gets you involved in a bit of desktop publishing work to try to make things fit, but that's all right. Figures are permitted. There aren't a set of rules exactly, as far as I know from NSERC, as to what is allowed. There were some old things referenced on their website back in the day when they would print off all these NSERC applications and send out huge boxes to the evaluation group's members, and these would be, of course, black and white laser printed versions. Everyone that I know is now looking at these grants online on their laptop, so feel free to use color figures. The other point I want to make in all this is when you're considering what type of method you're going to use, you may be considering some riskier, newer methods that you don't really have expertise in yet, that you've not been trained in yourself yet. I would suggest that you do not go down that road. Tell the story in your proposal that reflects your CV. What is your expertise? What are your programs of research? What is your credibility? Once you get the grant, this is the beauty of NSERC. It's my favorite tri-council agency because once you get the grant, go ahead and do whatever you want with that money. If you want to go and explore new risky methodology, you've got 5 years, hopefully, to do that. Save then the description of that new technology for the next application. Take a safer road that allows you to point to your own expertise and your own credibility with those techniques. Even though it might not perfectly reflect what you really want to do in the next 5 years, write the story that's going to make the best sense to those 5 people sitting around the table, again, knowing that maybe none of them have your level of expertise. Next slide. So just coming back then to this merit indicators piece, the idea then of how you're going to get from likely having impact to having impact by leading to advancements, ground-breaking advancements, etc. Please consider some of these strategies and tips that Lisa and I have been giving you. Okay, on to the next part.
So these are a couple of resources that you might want to refer to. The first one lists the NSERC instructions. So make sure you take a look at those and follow the instructions. Presentation standards for your proposal, the fonts, the margins, all that is at the second link there. NSERC will also be doing a series of webinars on RTIs on preparing your notification of intent and also your full application. So we have, I think the first RTI one is in June and the NOI, a couple of NOI ones in June and July. We've referred a couple times to the University of Saskatchewan Discovery Grant Repository. There's a large number of grants that are available. You can just log in with your NSERC, and you can take a look at other people's grants that have been successful and get a really sense of what they look at, what they look like, what the style is, and so I encourage you to go on and take a look at that. The next point, 5-minute NSERC videos. A lot of faculty have told me that they find those really useful before starting, for example, your HQP section, to take 5 minutes, go through the video, and make sure you hit all the high points. Archive presentations and documents. So this is on the University of Saskatchewan Research Services website. And presentations like the one today's, the ones from last year, all the documents that we've referred to, that significant contributions templates are all available on that site. And Universe, I'll mention this year, in the past, in order to get signatures from department head and from the college before going to research services, you used to have to walk around the printout of your discovery grant to get signatures. You no longer have to do that. It can be uploaded to the Universe system, and it will automatically be routed to your department head, to your college, and onto research services. If you have not had an opportunity to take a look at the system yet, there are workshops that are ongoing in it. The first one is today at 1:30 if you're keen and eager to get started. But if not, there's other ones in May, and there'll also be dates announced for June and July as well.
Just to mention again on that repository, so we started this last year. There are now over 24 NSERC grants from the U of S on that repository. Some of them are also annotated a bit in terms of how they scored on various categories. But yes, please do take a look at least the ones in your evaluation group area. I think you'll hear from the panel as well that when one takes on the job as an evaluation group member, and you start reading 60 grants in your first year, it's quite amazing how it helps you think of other styles, other approaches to communicating ideas. So I really do encourage you to take a look at that repository. People have been great at uploading grants as they've been getting awarded them in this past year. I think we saw about a dozen come online just in the last few weeks. Okay, I just wanted to make a quick plug as well for if you're contemplating whether you really want to go through the internal review process or not. Of course, workshops like this are helpful. The repository is helpful. There are other workshops that the research facilitators are leading as well. Everything helps. But I want to make a pitch for the actual going through the U of S internal review. Our stats, compared to 2014, last year U of S had a hit rate of 56%. When you just N-weight, give every individual equal a weighting in this. If you weight equally in terms of these categories, early career researcher, those that are hired within their first 2 years, their status as of career, established researchers and established researchers not holding a grant, the hit rate last year was actually 47%. Our overall N-weighted hit rate this year was 67%. When you equally weight by category, it's at 71. When we look at those individuals who participated in the internal review process last year, that was actually a 78% hit rate. So there is a significant effect of going through internal review in terms of benefit. It does have certain effects at certain levels of career. So if you can go to the next slide, Lisa. When we look at early career researchers, indeed, most of them, 9 out of 10 that participated in internal review were successful. And everyone, I think, engaged in workshops and the repository, et cetera. We had a really good hit rate for early career researchers this past competition, and much better than the year prior, where it was at 18%. The next slide. For established researchers, internal review may not be as big of a factor for you. If you're just now renewing your grant, you're just finishing up your last 5-year grant cycle, those who participated in internal review enjoyed a 74% hit rate. Those who all included, those who did and didn't, it was 77%. And it's on par with U of S and national averages. And then finally, established researchers, next slide please, Lisa, that weren't holding a grant, those overall had a 45% hit rate at the U of S this 2015 last year. Those who participated in internal review, 71%. So if that's you, yes, please consider participating in the internal review program. Next slide is just, I think, some statistics. I ran a sign test to show that it's a significant effect in terms of helping early career researchers and established researchers not holding grants. And the final slide on RTI. We haven't said a lot about RTI yet, so I guess we better put a few minutes into RTI. I have the privilege of chairing the President's NSERC committee. That committee also adjudicates which NSERC RTI grants get forwarded to Ottawa. For the past 2 years, it's been a quota of 17 that are allowed to go forward, and then Ottawa decides on which ones get funded. In 2014, the hit rate was 18% for U of S. This past year, 24%. So we still have some work to do here. Ottawa, I think, has been keeping the hit rate in and around 33, 38%. Nationally, I can only hope that maybe some of the federal money that we heard about in the latest budget will get injected into this portfolio. But nonetheless, let's talk a little bit about RTIs for a second. If you can go to the next slide, Lisa. So this is the RTI, Research Tools and Instrumentations Grant Application Rating Form. So I have all the members of the President's NSERC committee using this form, as it is also used, or has been used in Ottawa up until this year. And so please take a look at that. If you are thinking about putting in an RTI grant, I would also suggest that you let your internal reviewers know. So the people that you are suggesting for internal reviewers, let them know that you're also thinking of putting together an RTI application. And hopefully they'll take a look at that for you as well. Interestingly, in Ottawa, it is a different committee that considers the RTIs. It's not the same committee that considers the discovery grants as that was the case back in about 2010 when I started. However, there are some specific things here you'll notice in the rating form. The first two categories, excellence and experience of the researcher and merit of the programs to be supported, very similar in terms of what we've just talked about in terms of the discovery grant. The other things, though, need and urgency, suitability for proposed research. Those categories are specific to the RTI. And impact on HQP training, you can see this aspect of HQP also plays an important role in the RTIs as well. We have RTI members on this panel, so I'll let them say some additional things about this when it's their turn to talk.
I think much has been said. I just want to add 1 or 2 points. For the early career researcher, when you prepare your HQP, maybe you want to consider to include that because you're at the early stage of career and you may want to have a mentor to assist you to supervise your student. And also, like specifically in my committee, 1501, sometimes we also suggest an early career researcher to bring up a co-supervisor for their students. And also something for health-related research. Sometimes we spend a lot of time to discuss if there's overlapping between your research. This is fall into natural science category, or this is fall into health related research. So I think you need to spend some time to clarify your research is on addressing like basic, for example, molecular mechanisms on disease pathogenesis or molecule A function in, say, translation, transcription, and don't try to avoid this research will lead to therapeutic strategies. Whenever we see that word, basically is not eligible for NSE research. So yeah, that's pretty much.
Okay. Thank you. And just to pick up on that point about health-related research, are any of you in the audience also kind of on the boundary between natural science, engineering, and health? One of the things that I've mentioned to some of last year's applicants that appears to have worked successfully is think of, is there a particular patient population or health question that isn't to be posed as a question in and of itself or a translation, but instead a very important way to test a theory of basic mechanism. That approach seems to work with NSERC. And you're using then that specific patient population or disease or whatever as a test of the basic mechanism. So again, it requires sort of thinking about your approach maybe a bit differently. Okay, Regan.
Thanks. I'll just note that I'm a computer scientist, but my work actually falls kind of at the intersection of all three tri-councils, and I've received money from all three tri-councils. So both of my own grants and the ones that I've adjudicated in the past, I've had to deal with this issue of bridging, and so if you have any questions about that, I'm happy to try and answer them. I have so many things I'd love to add, but I think I'll stick to two things. So one of the things that wasn't mentioned, and maybe is not as official, and so maybe that's why I'll take it, is the way that people that are adjudicating your grants and the way that that works. So Ron's mentioned that there's 5 people who will read your grant and discuss it around the table. There's a first reader, a person who actually is asked to read and present your grant to the group. And so that first reader will take a lot of care in preparing notes to present your grant to the group. They'll read the contributions that you provide, the papers that you send along with it. They'll probably look up the quality of the venues if they're not familiar with them, and they'll probably be a little more familiar with your work. The second reader also will be a little more familiar with your work, and also will be encouraged to read the contributions that you send along with it, and will spend a little bit more time preparing their notes. The other 3 readers that make up the set of 5 are asked to review your grant, but they're not asked to look into your contributions, so they might not read your papers. And you should know by the time that the readers get to looking at your application, they've already done first and second review probably on about 25 to 30 grants. And so their remaining 25 to 30 grants that they read are at this level of reader. And so the likelihood is that they'll be taking a pass of your grant. I tried to get an estimate from other members of the committee on how long they actually spend doing this. And the consensus was somewhere between an hour and 2 hours if you're lucky. So on your grant for the readers. The thing that surprised me at the meeting is that I kind of knew, but really surprised me, was that everyone has equal vote. So when they vote on the indicator, the merit indicator, because that's the way it works, that the committee then votes strong, very strong, insufficient for each of the 3 categories. When they vote, all 5 of these members have equal weighting in the vote. So the people that read your grant very carefully have equal weighting to the people who are more doing a skim job and reading it kind of once over and making their notes. So you really do have to write. The majority of the people that are rating your grant are in this reader category. So you really do have to write to an audience who is very likely not familiar with your particular area of work. And the other thing to note is that other people in the room who are not assigned they're not allowed to comment on your grant. So you're really just writing to these 5 people, and the majority of them probably don't have expertise in your particular area. So you have to make their job easy. You have to kind of spoon feed them these merit indicators by using formatting, using white space, using figures. You saw some examples here where people bolded, our long-term objective is X. So really writing to these merit indicators and using formatting to your advantage is extremely important. And expect that someone who's going to read your grant is not going to spend a whole day kind of teasing out all the important factors from a wall of text. That's not likely to happen. The other thing that I wanted to mention was to focus on quality as well as quantity in all of the things that have numbers associated with them. So your publications, it's not just how many you have, but what's the quality of the venue, what's the impact. HQP training, it's super important that you report outcomes. This was something, if people weren't reporting outcomes of their HQPs, it reflected poorly upon them in the group that I'm part of. So you have to know, or you have to, at least for many of your students, where they've gone on and report on that. So if they've gone on to work at Google, if they've gone on to grad school, report on those things, because that reflects on the quality of your training as well as the quantity of the number of people you've trained. And if you're training undergrads, don't forget that. So if you supervise an undergrad research term and they went on to do a master's or a PhD at Stanford or MIT, that actually plays really well in the committee as well. So don't forget about those kind of outcomes that students, undergrads who have gone on to grad school, really plays a role as well. So that quality is just as important as quantity in your publications and your training.
Thanks, Regan. And just to underscore a couple of those points, your grant would get maybe 12 minutes, maybe at most 15 minutes of consideration in Ottawa. That's how efficient these people have to work. The other thing is, of those 5 members, it's a median of those 5 votes. So you can look up the membership lists of the various evaluation groups, and that's a good idea to kind of know who might be on your grant in terms of being a Reader 1 or Reader 2, et cetera. But realize as well, if there's an enemy of yours that's on that committee, because they're taking the median of those 5 votes, there is no one person who's going to have some extreme influence on a mean in any way that's going to affect the outcome. As long as there are 3 people that are reasonably adjudicating your grant, that's what's going to drive the median for that selection. Thanks. Jack.
So Reagan actually touched on a number of my points. Thank you, Reagan. It's going to take less time. But some of my comments are based on what I have experienced being in the room with the evaluators. And so these are things to help put you in the frame of mind of the people who are making decisions on your grant. So when it comes to the proposal, one of the things that I think is really important is to link your objectives together. Have statements in there of some way that shows that you've got a program of study versus a series of independent projects. Because if it's determined that it's a series of independent projects, the proposal can actually get a score of insufficient. So having something, even if it's one sentence for each objective to show how they link up and show that maybe some things in objective 2 will be guided by what you've done in objective 1 in some way, if that's how you're doing it. It shows a good continuity of what you're doing. And in that regard, one of the things that I have observed that a lot of reviewers can comment negatively on is if you're, let's say you have three short-term objectives, and you do this really great job of outlining and defining the methodology for the first 2, and then the third one just kind of seems to be this trailing off thing in this sort of add-on. That reflects negatively because the reviewers are thinking, well, you don't really know what you're going to do here, and that can affect the whole perception of the proposal itself. So try to have all your objectives equally explained and provide the strength in those explanations and methodologies. Don't leave one trailing off. When it comes to the methodology, you're describing how you're going to actually do the work you're doing, it's always a good idea to have a sentence in there somewhere saying that you can do this work. So something like these techniques are routine in my program. You have the expertise to do this. It talks about feasibility. It shows that you want to do this and you know how to do it. So even a simple sentence like that can help assure the reviewer that this proposal has a lot of merit. When it comes to the background, the literature review, for example, one of the things that I've seen a lot of reviewers comment on positively is if that literature review ends in a couple of sentences that clearly states what absolutely needs to be known in this field. That this is a big gap and we really need to know this, and then bang, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to do that. So you've got the reviewer's attention and excitement, and so they're going to look upon your proposal as, wow, okay, so you're going to address this gap that we see in the literature, and you can tie that into your recent progress as well in terms of what you've done, and so you can finish off things like your recent progress saying, and now we are poised to, and that can be part of the phrase bank, we are poised to do this, and we're going to go forward with that based on what you've identified as a clear need to do in the literature review. In terms of the chart that you saw of the HQP and the years and those things like that, another thing that it shows reviewers is it gives them a sense of the flow of the work that you're going to do over those 5 years. And even though you are identifying specific HQP, it gives them a sense that your program has a flow to it, and it's going to build, and it's going to have a logical sense of how it's going to go, instead of, you have all your objectives dealt with in willy-nilly years. But if you link it back to this in your proposal where you do link the objectives, that can be reflected in that particular chart on HQP. So you can convey quite a bit of information in a relatively small amount of space. So that's something to consider. And again, this is the kind of thing that the reviewers like to see. I've often heard a lot of positive comments on that. And if you want, if your reviewers are making positive comments, that's what you want to see when it's going forward for a decision.
Thanks, Jack. Lisa?
I think it gets harder as we go down the line here, because my colleagues are all making great points and taking things that I would have talked about too. Maybe what I'll do is just expand on a couple of things that have already been mentioned. With regard to overlap with CHR or SSHRC funding, just a couple of other pointers. Often what will happen is the reviewers will want to see what were your contributions in NSC. So it's okay to have grants and funding from other agencies. In fact, that can be viewed quite positively by the committee, as long as you've also still established a track record and record of accomplishment in NSC. So it's a good idea to indicate, for example, which of your publications and conference presentations were funded specifically or came specifically from your previous NSERC funding, or what activities are really going on within your NSC-funded research program. And you can also highlight that in your contributions when you talk about some of the areas, as Lisa had indicated, where you've made progress. Make sure you say this is within NSC. And that will help to reassure the reviewers that even if you do have a program of research that has a health component or a social science or SSHRC component, that you also have a clear component that's within NSC. And usually then there's no problem. The same thing, you want to make sure that your proposal is within NSC, and I think Ron made a great point about earlier about how you can capture the focus or the question of your research, even if you're working with patient populations, and I agree completely with the point he made there about how you cast that. The last thing is with HQP, you don't have to worry about who was funded by what grant. You just talk about all your HQP. At that point, the reviewers, they just want to see how many students have you had and how well have they done. They don't care if they were funded from your CHR grant or your SSHRC grant or your NSERC grant there, it doesn't matter. So you want to make sure you talk about all of your HQP, not just the HQP that you happen to pay from a previous NSERC grant. Leading in then to HQP, one of the things I noticed in my first year on the committee was how many outstanding researchers kind of torpedoed their application by not paying enough attention to HQP. So they had wonderful proposals, they had been publishing well, you know, the first two categories, they got high scores, and then you end up with a moderate for HQP because, you know, you could sort of tell that they just did it quickly and wrote kind of generic statements that were all fine, but sounded like the other 45 grants that I reviewed. But the 5 grants where people really took the time to identify HQP, to talk about exactly what awards did the students get. You know, are they getting NSERC postgraduate scholarships, for example? That's a great indicator. Are they getting postgraduate scholarships from other agencies? Are they getting poster awards? Are they winning awards for giving talks? Are they recognized at conferences? So you want to be very explicit about that. And you want to show, I think, when you write that section, that you take pride in your students. And I think Lisa mentioned that it's about the student, but I think you can convey that, not just that you have a great environment, everybody talks about how they have a great environment, but just that, you know, you almost view them as your academic children, and you really take pride in what they're able to accomplish while they're working with you. And I think that comes through in a very small number of the applications, but those ones really shoot up, and I think it can make a big difference, because if you can get an exceptional or an outstanding for HQP, you really bring up your overall score because it's 30%. So pay a lot of attention to that section and ask your colleagues for advice and go through the internal review because it can really make a difference.
Thank you, Lisa. Adil?
I think you covered it all. So I think the presentation you and Lisa made is excellent. I was going to highlight only the things that Lisa and Jack and Reagan didn't cover, and these are the things with respect to having a conceptual overlap between CIHI and NSERC. Those of you that may have a CIHI and NSERC, it's really critical to be able to distinguish that your NSC funding for NSERC is really for NSERC and not CIHR. And so if you have manuscripts that you've published and you're actually acknowledging both NSERC and CIHR, the question is always raised: what is the conceptual overlap? Why are these individuals? Why are these papers being acknowledged with these two sources of funding? So ideally, you really would like to be able to separate those two. Life sciences is funded by NSERC, but if you mention the word disease or health, it's automatically a no-no. So anything to mechanism is what you want. Do not use the word disease or health. That is something that I do not like. Clearly, the program is funded. Projects are not. So I would not even use the word project, because you use that, it's automatically a no-no. So programs, you do not want a series of experiments, you want a program. If it's a project, it's going to be flagged. I know you said that we should have some figures on the proposals. And in the committee that I was in, if there's too many figures,
Many, okay.
then sometimes that is regarded negatively as well, because you're using up valuable space on your proposal and including superfluous figures. Add 1 or 2 figures, sure, but if you got too many, that is not going to be good. As Lisa mentioned, I mean, HQP is critical. 33%, it's worth 33%. And as much as your proposal, as much as your excellent researcher. So make sure you spend enough time in your HQP, explain what you do with your students, your graduate students, high school students, undergraduate students. All that is very critical. Make sure there's no typos, no spellings. It's a really good idea, as Ron said, to get an in-house review done by colleagues. I mean, that makes a huge difference. There's a tendency of some proposals to use their contribution to graduate students as academic advisor. Well, that is not the same as being a graduate supervisor or co-supervisor. So that is not considered to be as critical as being a supervisor or co-supervisor. In certain professional colleges, they have a master's equivalent. Well, a master's equivalent is not the same as a master's. So identify what the student, is it a real bona fide master's? Is it in the NSC? Give them the title of your thesis. Critical to identify the support of your students. Where do they end up after they graduate? So all that has been mentioned. One last thing I'd like to add is that some grants are rejected and then they come back the following year. Well, when they come back the following year, the committee's changed. So they don't know if you made the changes. So if you can't stick in your proposal by saying, well, a line saying, well, I did this changing according to reviewer 1 or reviewer 2, then the committee will feel comfortable. Well, this guy was turned down the last time. He's coming back and he made those changes. They might be a bit more sympathetic. So if you can include a line or 2 as to what changes that you made from your previous application, if you happened to be coming in the second time, then they may be more sympathetic to the fact that unless there's somebody on the committee that was there from the last year, they won't know whether this proposal was modified or not. So that's the key few things. But I think stuff that Lisa said, Jack said, and Reagan said and what you, Ryan, said is really dead on. Critical to pay attention to those highlights, because that's makes a difference between a success and a failure. So, thanks.
Thank you, Adil. And just to pick up on that, I know NSERC tries hard. If you did have a grant being considered this last competition on this next year, they will not likely use the same R1. It'll likely be a different person as R1. And as Adil's pointed out, there could be some overlap. There might be 1 or 2 members that were on your grant last year that are on it again this year. And it is really up to you to decide how much you want to open the door to pointing out that you were unsuccessful last year. If there were some critical things that you're addressing, I think Adil's made a good point about saying that that's why you're addressing them. But you really do want to give a positive spin to your proposal. And you are getting a bit of a fresh chance with NSERC. They're not using the same 5 people around the table again for this year. Okay, Ildiko, with respect to RTI, you were an RTI member for engineering. Any additional strategies?
For the engineering committee, probably the other committees are diverse, but the engineering grants are really diverse because they are going from drug delivery to space and environmental and material sciences in energy, so it's a very wide range, and my suggestion is that if you write a grant, please use a very plain language, because last year there was no face-to-face meeting, so we had 5 grants to review each panel member, and these 5 members reviewed each grant. And then, so these 5 members are from limited number of disciplines, so you really have to make sure that you write the grant in a very plain and understandable language. Because of the variety of the grants coming in, most of the time they have research teams, and then what I would like to point out only the need and urgency section, that these diverse teams should have people need for that piece of equipment. So if somebody is just on the grant because they are a good name and to add to the list, please don't. They all have to show that they will use that instrument and there is an added value to their research program. And similarly in the HQP, if each of the members on the grant will train their HQPs in their respected area and there is no sense of collaboration or having a little bit more added value, and this is what is a little bit different from the Discovery Grant, that the added value here is to show that these different areas will have a collaborative outcome at the end of the receiving this instrument. So these are the few issues that in this committee, those people who were successful, they showed always the added value that this instrument will bring to the whole team.
Great. Thank you, Ildiko. Carrie.
Thank you. As everyone has said, most things have been covered off, first of all, by your presentations. Really good. Just a couple things, and they've been mentioned, but I wanted to say that really I found and I learned a lot in this process. And quality, and you used the word implications, and I would say impact are really important. Most things that we do at this university and university across Canada, internal reviews are really based on numbers. But when you go to this evaluation group, the numbers really take a back seat. And it's what is the quality? And it's not enough to say, I was the first to do this. Someone will say, why is it the best? And why do I care? Who else is now using it, either as researchers, as industry, wherever? So what is the impact? The other thing is to start early, and that's why it's good that we're here today discussing this. But in reality, it's already too late because we can't change anymore at this time. Really, we can only wordsmith. We can't really change our past contributions anymore. We can somehow direct our proposal, but even that, it's probably too late. So, but it's good we're at least discussing today. The other thing I was going to say about the internal review, when you go to speak to your internal reviewers, I'd encourage you to say you only have 1 hour to review this proposal. Why? Because 3 of the 5 people will only spend an hour on the proposal. I mean, an hour is really short. I haven't got it to less than an hour, but I certainly, even as a full reviewer, or the first reader or second reviewer, don't spend more than 2 hours. So tell them to read it in that time, which is a very fast read, but that will maybe hit those three reviewers that have an important piece. One other little point, the early career researchers, I don't know if there are any that apply to this, but it's not only 2 years within your first appointment, it's 2 years of independent research. So take a look at that and don't oversell your past work as independent because it'll put you as an established researcher. The other thing, I think this phrase bank is really good, and look at the evaluation grid and the rating form, but don't use words that don't match what you've done. It really gets frustrating when in the proposal in 3 places in bold you say, this is very feasible research because, and every time as a reviewer you're thinking, no, no, no. So don't, use the words and use the words they want to hear, but don't, if it doesn't match, don't use it. Excellent researchers, one, I think that thing that wasn't mentioned was awards. External awards are really important, and don't just list them and assume that the reviewers know what that award means, but say what it is. You know, every year in Canada, across Canada, there's only 5 of these awards given out, or someone put, even in their editorial board, I'm the first Canadian to serve as editor of this journal. Things like that. Try to quantify them. Don't just assume people will know. And I'll just touch on the HQP here quickly. Lisa already mentioned this when she talked about taking pride, treat them as your academic children. I personally have 10 children at home, so I don't usually talk about academic children, but that's okay. I did notice I used the word, though. Many people will say what their students will learn. but not how they will nurture them. So I guess that's getting close to children, I guess, but that's one thing I thought. And the other thing, this is really an intense process. Don't think, and maybe that's why you're here, you don't think, but many think that the work of the evaluation group is sort of superficial. They kind of like, oh, whatever. It's really intense. I had many dreams about evaluating proposals, and now I'm up next fall, and I'm already starting to have dreams about my proposal at night and what I should put and things like that. So it's a serious business, I think, and so you obviously are here because you treat it that way, but maybe somehow pass that on to your colleagues as well.
Great. Thank you, Carrie. Patrick. Patrick is also a chair of an RTI committee and has experience with other evaluation group work as well.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. Yeah, I'll just mention a few things briefly about the discovery grants, and then spend most of the time with the RTIs because that's what I've been on the most recently. The point about starting early, I think, is really important, and especially if you're going for renewal, once you get a grant, I used to actually start thinking already, where do I want to be in 5 years? To try to think about how I can position myself so when I write my next grant, I'll be in that place. And that comes to planning, publications, and everything. So it's really good. The earlier you start thinking about that, the better off you are. Another one about internal reviewers is don't be upset by an internal reviewer that rips your grant to pieces. In fact, I'd rather have it ripped to pieces by an internal reviewer than have it ripped to pieces by a committee or an external when it's in the review process. You're far better off having an internal review that's very critical than one that says, yeah, it's great work, submit it as it is, okay? So really take it to heart when you get an internal review and they really point out what you can do to improve it. One thing from the perspective of a chair that hasn't been discussed here yet is your LOI. Most people slap that together on July 31st in a couple minutes. It's actually what's used by the folks at NSERC and the chairs of the committee to pick the external reviewers and to pick the committee members who are going to be first and second reader and the third to fifth readers. And every year as a chair, I would come across a few applicants who ended up writing a discovery grant that was very, very different from what their LOI said they're going to do. And because of that, they ended up with reviewers who were not in as good a position to review their grants. All right, so really, when you write that LOI, make sure that it is being written so that you get the kinds of reviewers you want to see your grant, okay? Regarding the RTIs, I'll just touch on a couple other things which have been mentioned by Aldiko already. I've been on 3 different types of NSERC panels for 8 out of the last 10 years, and the RTIs are actually the hardest ones I've ever had to review because they are all written by people who, of the vast majority, already have NSERC funding. Everybody needs equipment. And because it is reviewed virtually, the committee never meets, all right? We never talk about it. So you can't, essentially, if I misinterpret what someone says in an application, there's not a chance for 4 other committee members to correct me on that or say, well, I don't think that's really what they meant. I have to interpret it by what you've written, and then I submit a score. And I don't talk about it with other committee members unless there's some real glowing issue once all the scores come in. And as a chair of an RTI panel, this past year that happened for 1 out of 89 applications. So you can assume that the committee will never discuss your grant amongst themselves, okay? So the clarity of writing it is just absolutely critical for an RTI as much or more than any other type of application, because you have to get your point across in simple language. And if it's going to be misinterpreted by someone, there's no chance for it to be corrected with respect to that interpretation. And just a quick note on the scoring, so you know how the RTIs are scored. It's actually quite a bit different than the discovery grants. The RTIs are scored on a flat scale of 1 to 10. And what that means is if I have 30 applications to review, I have to give 3 of them a 1, 3 of them a 2, 3 of them a 3, 3 of them a 4, and so on. Okay, so it's a completely different type of scoring system, and then they just take the average of those 5, and that's your final score. Okay, I think that was about it. Again, the RTI success rate, they don't take as much time to prepare, and I really urge people to try to get those RTIs in, because you can get up to $150,000 from NSERC, and in fact, the amount you ask for does not determine whether or not you have a better chance to go. Some people think if you only ask for $10,000, you get a better shot at it, and it's not true. Grants that are asking for $150,000 are just as likely to be funded as ones that are asking for $10,000 for an RTI.
Okay, thanks, Patrick. Daniel.
Okay, I'll just reiterate that, to the members here in the audience that I think the slide deck is excellent, and so definitely look at it carefully, as well as the comments from my colleagues here at the front. Although I'm second last, I still have some comments here that I actually want to mention, just based on doing these types of reviews for about 9 years now on these panels. And I'll just start at the top with the excellence of the researcher. When you've reviewed 60 grants, you want to find grants that stand out. Too often you'll review grants and you hear the same or see the same thing over and over and over again. And in the excellence of researcher, the one area that I think really doesn't get a proper job is in the significance of the contributions. So there were some areas mentioned in the slide deck, and I'll just reiterate that you have to prove that your contributions are significant, and it seems to be something that is poorly done. Saying that it's all great or that it's made an impact doesn't mean anything if you don't provide any proof. So in that section, when you have collated a bunch of publications on a particular topic and you want to make the case that it was a significant contribution, you need to say things like, it led to the invitation to chair a session at a conference on this topic. It led to me being invited to edit a review series on the topic. I was invited to chair a certain panel based on my expertise in this topic. Failure to do that means that when I read it and I just simply see words like high impact, means that I'll pretty much just take it as the same as everybody else, and it won't stand out. And you want your applications to stand out. So take that to heart. And secondly, in that section, you have journals that you're listing, your publications. And for 1501, which is the old cell biology, so I'm a reproductive biologist or developmental biologist, so I have a specific expertise, but the other 4 people that are rating that grant may not have that expertise. They don't necessarily know that the journals you're listing are high quality. So I like to see someone who will take the time and say, these publications are in the top 2 or 3 journals in the field. And if you don't say that, other people in the panel who are reviewing that grant, they have no idea, perhaps, that maybe that journal, even though it may have an impact factor of 3, is the top journal in that field, because we know that impact factors don't take into account the breadth or the size of the field. So take the time to show the impact. Don't just use some general modifiers that don't really mean anything when you compare it to 60 other grants. From the standpoint of the proposal, I want to differ a little bit from what Ron said about, he kind of made a point about playing it a little safe if you're interested in developing or working with a technique you don't have experience with. There is definitely a push more and more to innovativeness in your research. I want to throw out the possibility, because I've seen it on really good applications, that scientists, researchers do not really pay enough attention to what's available on their campus. So you may feel that you don't have a lot of expertise in a particular technique, but if you go looking on campus, I bet you'll find it. Here at U of S, we have so much infrastructure that people are not aware of. And, that could be imaging, it could be molecular work, it could be the mass spec units, it could be just, antibody development. And yet, if you don't know it exists, you can't talk about it as a potential, resource. And therefore, not only does that play to the feasibility of your research, where you could say, I have all this expertise I could use, and all these technicians who could train my HQP, but it plays on the training plan that you can say, your trainees can go see these people, learn the techniques, and get the job done. So I just want to mention that as another way to think of it, that explore your campus. We have so many tools here, and people just don't know enough about those tools. And then lastly, I want to point out that, especially early career researchers, the choice of reviewers. Over the years, it's amazing. Do not choose the top person in your field, especially if you're an early career researcher, to review your grant. It might seem obvious, but it happens all the time. And I suppose if I think back to when I was just starting, you're a bit cocky, you think you know a lot, you got your first job, so you think, I'm going to have this Nobel Prize winner review this grant. And it happens too often. They have no expertise reviewing discovery grants. In fact, I would suggest all applicants, when they want to suggest reviewers, talk to their colleagues in the field, pick people that know how to review in the NSERC environment. It's really, really important. We see so many reviews come back that are not helpful at all. You're not doing yourself any service by picking reviewers who are not appropriate to review a discovery grant. And that's what I'll leave it
Great,
at.
thanks, Daniel. And just to pick up on that, indeed, NSERC as a co-chair, when you're picking through who might be good external reviewers, we're told, pick from the list that the applicant has given, but also here's a bank of names and expertise. So they're not all going to come from there, but if you treat that list that you provide as people that you kind of trust, they know the NSERC system, you may not know them personally, but you have a sense that they would do a good job reviewing your grant. They will be sort of treated like friendlies, if you will, if you think of a journal submission. So the idea, though, is yes, do avoid, I agree with Daniel completely on this because I made that very same mistake my first time on Discovery. It's picking a world expert, didn't live in Canada, and yeah, that wasn't a great idea on my part. Okay, thank you. And lastly, Ian, who was on the RTI Chemistry Committee.
Maybe I could start by first asking the audience how many people are planning on putting an RTI application in this year. Okay, so you saw the stats, 24%. NSERC RTIs are a really tough nut to crack. So I would make a couple suggestions. One, look at the evaluation criteria. You can find the peer manual, the peer review manual online. That's what we on the panel are supposed to be using to evaluate your proposal. And then put your mind in the same position that we're in, right? You're going to read 30 of these. You have to use a flat ranking. And what you'll find is the system's a bit skewed. If you look at some of the criteria, you have quality of the candidate. And then you're reading a proposal that comes from a university where you have 5 CRC chairs who are applying for pretty much a standard piece of equipment. It's pretty difficult not to rank them incredibly highly on the quality of research here. So if you're an individual at the U of S, right, and you want to put in an application or a piece of equipment, you probably would be well served to find out if there are colleagues, maybe not in your department, but in other departments, who would also need that piece of infrastructure. Don't put square pegs in round holes, though. Ildiko mentioned this. That's a great way for me to just throw out your proposal if it looks forced. But if you have a viable connection with another researcher or another 2 researchers, that will really help strengthen your case for the RTI. The other thing that I didn't realize, and I'd put in RTI applications before, and I didn't really pay this enough attention until I was on the panel, was deal with things like where is the equipment going to be housed, how are you going to operate it, and how will it be maintained, right? There's a whole section there just on that as a category. And give due diligence. So maybe it's trivial, right? So this is going to be a standalone HPLC. It's going to sit in Dr. X's lab. Their grad students will maintain it, right? There it is, though. I can check it off on the box. If it's not there, I'm not going to give you the benefit of the doubt and assume that you've made arrangements. Other than that, I think most of the major points have been hit on the RTI case. But I would also say don't leave it to the end. A lot of times you're writing your discovery grant at the same time that you're going to put your RTI. So you just wait and you sort of say, oh, I'll just knock this off after I've done my discovery grant. And I would say if you have a success rate of 24%, it requires a lot more attention and a lot bigger of a head start than just waiting to the last minute. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Ian. I think we'll go to Ottawa now. Can you come off of mute there, Carolyn? Are you able to hear? Okay. Do you have any pieces of advice, strategies, or any news that you'd like to share with us?
Sure. I mean, well, you guys have covered quite a lot of different points, and it's really, really good for you guys to have this kind of a session. I mean, we can talk about some of the new stuff that's going on that you might have received information on. So new this year to NSERC in terms of being an early career researcher. If you are due to renew your grant for the first time in the 2017 competition, you do have the option of extending with funds for an additional year. So that information was sent out to the research grants officer in the last week. So it just provides early career researchers that additional year to grow your HQP program, to finish up your any experiments, and really now that you have this information, start building for your next application.
That's awesome news. Carolyn, is that going to be going forward as well? So all early career researcher grants will be 6-year grants if they wish?
If they wish. If they wish, yeah. That's a good point, because you do have the option, if you feel as though your application is, or you have a strong 6-year cohort and you really want to put that application forward, you can certainly take advantage of it. But again, the additional year does include the $5,000 supplement that you're receiving on top of your Discovery Grant. So it's a good opportunity for new researchers. Do we want to maybe point out a couple of things?
Yeah, both of us were sort of commenting to ourselves about different things that were said and different tips that were given. And so just from our perspective, one of the things that I was listening to and sort of, wondering to myself, when you were discussing about the choice of contributions, which ones to highlight with your application, one of the things to remember is that if you do choose to include something that's outside your 6-year window, the impact that the committee is going to look at is the incremental impact within the last 6 years. So they're not going to, if you're focusing on the numbers, you might not win that game, because you're only going to look at the additional citations and the impact that has been felt from that work in the last 6 years. So I just wanted to make sure that that was clear. Another thing to keep in mind is if you are going to choose articles or whatever publications from a time when you weren't an independent researcher, so when you were either a PhD student or a postdoc, you want to make sure that you clarify your contribution to that, because in terms of NSERC and how we look at people in those positions, that's not yet considered independent research. So if there is a contribution that you yourself made, you need to really justify that, because the assumption is that you're still under the guidance of someone else, and so that it's not all your ideas and all of the impact can't be attributed to you. So you need to be able to demonstrate what aspects and what impact was your work and your ideas, and that can be harder to do if it's a publication that was put forward when you were a student.
So just a couple notes on HQP as well. So someone had mentioned putting the different titles for how you interacted with that student. So one of the things that we come across quite often is people that use academic advisor in the CCV when they're listing. And so what we've been trying to tell all applicants is you can use this, but if you do, you have to make sure that you provide context around it. What specifically do you mean by academic advisor? Because it's not clear. Some people use it as, I told this student how to use this thing one time in my lab, and that I advised them academically. And so, it's a way to increase your numbers on HQP, but the reviewers they're trained to look through that and to really assess the levels. The other point for that is for if you're co-supervisor. So it's fine to be co-supervising in all sorts of different, all the different levels count. But if you're co-supervising, just make it explicit how the two are working together. So what's your contribution to the training of that student specifically? How are you helping in conjunction with the other supervisor?
And I was going to say too, in terms of the budget justification and the overlapping funds, it's definitely, there was discussion about how it's has an impact with, especially in health-related areas, because you want to make sure that you're not muddying the waters and that there's not then a question of the overlapping in mandate. It's also, it can be an issue too in other areas where they're particularly like any large infrastructure funding that comes through CFI, if there's a component that of those funds that are involved in your work, but you don't explain where that ends and where other support begins, then it becomes really difficult for the community to assess. And this is in particular with respect to subatomic physics. So just for information, I'm not sure that it applies to many researchers at your university, but it's a very important area to really clearly describe in your budget justification, particularly if you are someone who works in different areas and you're supported by different grants, what students are supported off which grants or what activities or whatever it is. Just make sure that it's very clear for the committee, because they may not, it may not be clear to them just reading it, the demonstration of the need for funds. So, and again, I'm using the subatomic physics language there because we still use the need for funds criteria, so that's where that comes from.
And I guess maybe if I could have one final point just on overlap. So as was mentioned, it's important to really describe if you have research funding from another different institutions, it's okay to have CIHR funding, SSHRC, but just to be very clear about what areas that research funding is covering, and to make it very explicit how the budgets are separated. It's okay to have health in a component as a long-term impact, but really the proposal should be focused on a program of research in the natural sciences and engineering. And so, if you work in the interface between the two disciplines, just highlighting what specifically is natural sciences. I liked Lisa's point about highlighting which papers were NSE specific, and just making it very clear to the members how this program of research is separate, but also long term they combine with one that may be in the health research.
And probably the same explanation would be good for your description of highly qualified personnel, because you probably are going to have people who start off on one side and move to the other potentially later in their career. So just as long as it's clearly identified the impact for NSE, Natural Sciences and Engineering, then that if you can clarify that for the reviewers and make that, so they don't have to guess or infer or wonder, then that will help, I think, strengthen the clarity of the application, and then it'll be easier to assess.
Okay, great. And just for clarification on publications in the CCV, is NSERC still asking that you put an asterisk in front of your students' names on those?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's one of those kind of ways where sometimes they can figure out who has worked with you, even if you haven't been able to gain the signature for consent to sharing the names, because there's no expectation of privacy when you publish that your name's not going to be there. So that is one way that you can still identify students that you've worked with, even if you haven't kept in touch with them and been able to get their permission to share names.
And if there's one way of making a reviewer mad, it's when you don't put the asterisk next to the name, because it takes tons and tons of time, and they have to have one list of reviewers counting the numbers. Just putting the asterisk does a whole lot of help for helping with the clarity.
Okay, well, thank you, Carolyn and Kim. I think we'll turn now to questions from the audience. And we have a microphone that we're going to pass around. Hopefully you'll be able to hear as well in Ottawa. So, first hand up, Carl.
Hi, I'm Carl Gutman from Computer Science. My question is, how do the committees deal with words like innovation and originality? And are there particular guidelines for that? And I don't know, just what should we be thinking about when we try to write up research that is original and innovative?
Be explicit and give as much detail about it as possible. Prove it, in other words. Try to prove that this is truly going to be like that. Using the words just in a general way as a buzzword gets you nowhere.
Not sure if that gives you all the answers you wanted, Carl, but I think the idea is evidence.
Can I add whether is exciting or new a bigger component of innovative?
I think, in fact, maybe put in on this one. I mean, the panels are, there's a human aspect to them, right? So it's a panel of peers, researchers from all different backgrounds and training, and so it's sort of what we rely on them. There's no way that NSERC is going to be very specific as to this is how you do innovation. That's the people aspect of them understanding, and recognizing when they see something like that. However, you can have a look at the peer review manual. That it does go across with some specific examples for those certain criteria. It's one of the resources that I don't think was mentioned at the end of the slide, but having a look at that, all of our members are very familiar with the peer review manual, or we hope that they are. And you can have a look at the different criteria for originality.
Great, thank you. I see there's a new Discovery Grant peer review manual just specific for Discovery Grants now. Sorry, did that come through? It's a new Discovery Grant peer review manual, and it doesn't contain RTI information in it anymore. Is there a separate one that does contain the RTI information?
Yes, so there's two different manuals. If you go to the peer review website, There's one specifically for discovery grants, which is updated each year, and there's one specifically now for RTI.
And there is one specifically for subatomic physics, but we don't post it because it would be way too confusing because people would cross-reference the two because subatomic physics also has RTI, an RTI component.
Right.
So anyway, if you're interested in that, then you need to contact NSERC directly, and you can do it through the Res Grants email address, or you can contact me directly, kim.bonnet@NSERC.
Great, thank you. Next question.
I was just going to add something here if I
Oh,
can.
sorry, go ahead, Carrie.
So by itself, new is nothing. It really is. Like, we have to know why it's really important to do this new thing and what impact it will have.
Incremental can also be new.
Okay, next question.
All right. I'm an early career researcher, and I had a few questions about how to put in, write about significant contributions from your postdoctoral work or previous work, because I don't have publications as of yet from my own lab, right? So when you're describing significant contributions, do you have, let's say, do you have to, if your research, you have only 2 research programs, do you cluster all of the public things as you have to list 5 significant contributions, right? Do you have to list?
It's at least, so it's really up to the applicant to decide how many they wish to put together into that. And if we go on the theme of clustering, if it does work for you, where a certain group of papers together make up a program of research, you maybe only have 2 clusters or 2 programs of research. That would be fine. It's really up to you if you're going to do that clustering and develop them into programmatic descriptions. That said, I mean, lots of people do just gather 5 articles and make that their 5 most significant contributions, or other things, patents, etc. But it really does depend on what you can do with the CV that you have and at the stage of career that you are in. Maybe others would chime in on this.
One thing I would say, because you haven't published as an independent investigator, it's really important then for you to tell the reviewers what your contribution is to those specific papers. Right? So if they're papers you published as a postdoc, well, maybe you did 90% of the work and you were the driving force. And if that's the case, you should say that. But if you weren't, you also should say that as well. So, you don't want to embellish too much. You want to be truthful about what your contribution was, and then talk about the impact of that work.
Another question regarding this, my program is very interdisciplinary, in the natural sciences itself, I do a lot of work with chemistry and biology. So the thing is, when I'm writing a proposal, right, can I include there are no team grants anymore, right? But I do need the help of another PI to do most of the work in the proposal. So how do I represent it? Or can I say I'm going to collaborate with this person and I'm going to trust them to do this and this part of the proposal? Or
Well, you can definitely make reference to who you're collaborating with. I think you want to play it very carefully, though, to not give a majority of weight in the proposal to other people's, that they're going to have to do that work. This really is, your discovery grant that you are the PI on. So I think you need to strike a balance there. That would be my impression, but others, please.
Yeah, I think also it's really going to be really important to show how your trajectory as an independent investigator is going to develop as you do this, right? So that you want to be very, very careful as an early career researcher to show that you're becoming very independent in what you're doing. It doesn't mean you can't collaborate with people, but you clearly have to show that you're going off on a pathway that is going to be yours, and that won't necessarily completely rely on others to be doing work with you.
With the collaboration aspect, make it, when you write it from the perspective that you're handing it off, that you're going to be doing this work, and then you're handing it off to a collaborator who will continue it on in this direction, or that will contribute complementary experiments or whatever it is. And also be very careful in your wording, making sure you're not using generic words like we, because that could mean you and your collaborator and everyone else. So make it very clear what you're doing and what your collaborator is doing, and make it seem like that's the next step.
I just want to suggest that you can highlight that in your HQP training plan as providing extra value to your HQP, that they get exposed to this interdisciplinary environment. And in that case, it'll be seen as a real plus that you have these collaborations going on that are maybe funded by other grants. But in terms of your actual proposed research, I would caution you to be careful about including too much collaboration with other researchers in there, because this really is an individual grant.
So can I just add to that too as well? I think it's everybody hears the same thing. I think the thing is you don't want to put a proposal by saying that, okay, objective 1 and 2 I'll do, objective 3 is going to be done by my collaborator, because then, that's risky, I think. I think it has to be driven by you as the independent investigator. Discovery grant is for the independent investigator. So.
We have a question up here.
Hello, my name is Hui Wan from Department of Chemical and Biological Engineering. I have a few questions regarding to the HQP. First question is, visiting professors and visiting PhD students from other countries regarded as HQP. The second question is talking about the past HQP. For example, I have a master student who is a lady, and then she decided to be a housewife. So is this a kind of quality evaluation? Something like, you hope your students to be a professor, to be a senior researcher, but it turns, she decided to go to, to be a housewife. So that is, it's not your fault, right? This kind of thing. So, and the third question is about co-supervised HQP. So, for example, if the student doing your own project and you involve another faculty to be a co-supervisor, how to kind of describe this kind of contribution, something like that. So.
Okay. Does anyone want to take a stab at that? I think I can start. I've certainly seen applicants make reference to visiting professors and so on as part of their HQP. You'd have to be very clear on how that person was coming to your lab to learn a particular skill set that you were able to teach them, explain how that worked. Regarding, your second point, I think life happens to everyone and they make decisions all the time. I think the people sitting around the table at NSERC making decisions about grants are very, very aware of the fact that students and so on, they change their paths. And I think I would just be honest about where everyone has gone on to, and there's nothing wrong with that. This is, I think, part of life. Your third point, I may have forgotten about it now, co-supervision. Indeed, I think this came up earlier. Make sure that you indicate your contribution to the co-supervision. I think as Carolyn was pointing out, it gets a little fuzzier if you start using terms like advisor. And I think committee members probably appreciate if you're looking at someone who's listing either co-supervision or advisor, that you are very explicit about what your contribution, what your role was in that. Others?
I just want to pick up maybe on the HQP question a little bit from the standpoint of, as you said, Ron, that we all know that not everyone's going to become an academic. So you're kind of looking generally at what's the overall trend of where the trainees are going. Some will leave science, and that can happen. That's fine. What I would suggest are two things. One, keep track of your trainees, their career tracks. Just because someone maybe goes off on maternity leave or decides they want to do something other than science doesn't mean they will not come back to it. So it's amazing how many people lose track of their students, and then that can actually be a disservice. You may actually find they've gone back to science again later on. So that's one thing. Two, just because someone maybe goes to, say, medicine or dentistry doesn't necessarily mean that that isn't a science-related career. As someone who has had and still tries to get CIHR funding, and it also looks at grants that have applicants that have CIHR funding, if they go to medicine, they could still become a clinician scientist. So that's still science-related. You just need to think a little bit outside the box of what is science related in terms of training and their future careers. So don't underestimate that.
Maybe if I can jump in, because you touched on something close to home. My wife is a homemaker. We have 10 kids. But I think the key is consistency, actually in this and in many other things. So let's say I have a plan to train, and I'm going to have 4 students a year. And I'm going to do this. In the past, I only had 1 student a year. Well, how is that? Or my students will publish 5 journal papers before they're done. And then in the past, they've only published one. And the other thing is you'd be surprised how when you have 10 eyes looking at this proposal, plus with the reviewers, how things come up. And so related to that, so you have someone who is a homemaker. I think you just say that. Be honest, bring it out, and don't try to hide things. If someone took 10 years to finish a PhD, you better say something about it because others will. They will notice those. So I think you can't hide things. That's what I found is don't think you can hide. People will see it and then it'll raise questions. So just be honest and address it.
Sorry, Dr. Wang, I'll come back to you because you don't have the microphone right now. I'm going to spread it around a bit. We'll come back to you. Go ahead, Sherry.
I wanted to talk about something we haven't brought up yet, which is field work. I do field work. And I was curious to learn about your thoughts on having an international component of field work to the research program that you're proposing for the 5-year Discovery Grant, versus whether we should be focusing all of the field work on Canadian research sites. Recognizing, of course, that any international field work has to link back to advancing knowledge in Canada. But.
Great question. Anyone on the panel with fieldwork experience who'd like to comment on that? Or in Ottawa?
I mean, I don't have any fieldwork experience, but I think what you mentioned right there at the end about it's good to have those kind of things. I mean, for HQP, anyways, you're exposing them to international research, lots of good training, but making sure that you focus on how the research impacts are going to impact Canadian research or bring the knowledge back to Canada would be all my thoughts for that.
Yeah, just impact. I mean, it's a lot of it is always the question. Again, is it comes back to impact and not necessarily numbers or whatever that sometimes gets easy to count. But it's what is the impact of those training excursions or whatever the term is in your field. So I mean, in terms of the committee that I'm used to dealing with, there's a lot of research that happens outside of Canada. So there's a lot of facilities in the United States and in Europe that have accelerators, and that's where a lot of the research for subatomic physics happens. And so this kind of work happens regularly on Discovery Grants, but it's because the students go there and they learn, they're either there to take shifts for the data or, they're there to learn and then they come back and then the publications happen out of, with their collaborators or with their supervisors here in Canada. So there's not a problem with international work, that's for sure.
Sorry, did you want to add to that, Lisa? Go ahead.
Well, I don't do field work, but on my committee, I don't think it would be viewed negatively for somebody to be proposing international field work. I wouldn't shy away from it because you're worried about it being international. I would focus on the quality of the work. If you have the opportunity to engage in international activities that are a good experience for you, will increase the impact and quality of your research and provide good opportunities to your HQP, I see that as a positive, and I think committee members would too.
Okay, thank you. My name is Hang Nguyen, and I'm in electrical and computer engineering. I have two questions. First question regarding the cut-off date of the information that you can report. So in both the HQP and research contribution, you're supposed to describe your contribution in the last 6 years. So how exactly we determine the cut-off date? Like for example, how far do I go back for my publications, and also apply with the students? Okay. So the second question is regarding the description of your HQP contribution. So the panel has talked a lot about talking specifically about HQP, right? What are the other things that we can add? Like for example, should I describe about my courses development, like for graduate courses, and writing a textbook, for example, does it help? And I mean, keeping in mind that we have probably only one page to describe the HQP.
Great questions. I think I might ask Ottawa to chime in on the cutoff date on the CCV, because this is something that's changed a bit since 2010. And if you want to maybe comment on that first.
I think it's a function of the CCV. So the CCV at the time that you save it will look at the calendar date and go back 6 years. So if you update your CCV at the time in August If you make any changes between August and November, then if there's anything in that 3-month period, that times out, it won't allow you to make changes and save it without deleting some of the oldest content. So if you don't update your CCV, then I think the most time you can get in there is from your submission from August 1st, 6 years back from that.
Yeah, I'll have to do some playing around with the system. I think, well, I was just looking at the peer review manual and it just says 6 years, so I can understand there's some confusion there.
Yeah.
But I think it's from the date of submission, so it would be...
The sure date would be November 1st and 6 years backwards.
Yeah.
So if you have a critical publication that you want to make sure gets included, but if you update too close to the deadline to then have it fall off, that's something to watch for. I actually thought that some discussions that we had back in 1502 a couple years ago, that maybe NSERC was looking at a slightly different way of working the cutoff, so it wasn't so specific to just exactly 6 years, but anything within that 6th year would still count. You haven't heard anything along those lines?
We can look into it and get back to you on that. You caught us, we're not sure.
No,
with the CCV, we have to struggle within the barriers of what the technology allows us to.
And because it's a whole bunch of different organizations that all agree on that format, so making any change at all is really painful.
So how does it work with graduate students? In the CCV, I never worked with the new CCV system yet because my application was 5 years back. So when we enter the HQP information, did we enter the convocation date for the students? Or?
It has months, so I think you can kind of play around with the months. I mean, I never know, should I say May because that's when I was done, or should I say June because that's when I graduated, things like that. So you can play around with it. It's got a bit of flexibility, but it's a good point that you raised up. For anyone that hasn't actually used the CCV before, give yourself a lot of time to input that information. It always takes longer than you would think, and there are some limitations with the program. So give yourself a time over the summer. But yeah, Kim and I will definitely look into it, and I guess respond back to Ron, just letting you know about how that specific date works for the 6 years.
Thank you. Another question back here.
Yes, thank you. I'm Khan Wahid from College of Engineering. My question is, how is your contribution to undergraduate program reviewed by the committee members? For example, courses, labs. So if you develop these kinds of things, is it good to highlight them? Or I don't know how it's going to play out. So this is the question for the committee members.
That is a good question, and I hope someone else has a better answer than I do. I think in the past I've told people that one of the things you can consider is if it's a course that you have, let's say, a lot of hands-on research technique being taught, that maybe it serves as a bit of a feeder into your lab, that students get interested in your work and then come knocking to do an honors thesis someday or an independent project, that if there's a way for you to spin it or pitch it so that it shows how it is relevant to your research program. That would be one response. To others?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's dead on. That's exactly the way to go, you're establishing a pipeline of introducing your expertise and training to people who will then come and work in your lab, at least some of them.
Yeah.
I think that's a great way to do it.
I guess I would also recommend being balanced there. You run a little bit the risk of making it seem that you're spending an awful lot of your time on teaching-related activities, and committees want to make sure that people have time to focus on research. So if you do that, just be mindful of making sure you're not creating the sense that you're spending an awful lot of your time on courses and teaching and not on direct activities related to research.
Can I just add, it's also space in your proposal, so it's not just time, but if you have the space in your proposal to be talking about your teaching activities, then what are you leaving out in terms of the stuff that goes into the actual merit indicators? So I saw people that had teaching awards or very special things that were arising out of their teaching that was related to their research. But if you have a lot of space in your proposal to talk about your teaching activities, then you're not talking about the things that are going into your merit indicators for the actual evaluation.
Yeah, in general, you don't get any consideration. You don't get any consideration for teaching. Right? If that was the case, then CRC chairs would be penalized. Right? Nobody cares how high your teaching load is.
If I can just add one more point, I think the goal, at least when NSERC was originally putting together their format for the CCB, it was to highlight the activities and the contributions that you make that are above and beyond what is typical for someone, in a department with a faculty appointment. So we don't necessarily want you to list all of your committee memberships and all those kinds of things. I agree with the point that you want to, if you have any awards or something for teaching, like you want to highlight the things that differentiate you from someone else in the department.
Yeah, and the thing that sometimes is done is you'll see someone who's got an HQP list of about 100 people, and they've included all of the students specifically in engineering for the capstone projects or things like that. And so there's a very, very specific list of HQP inputs that you can put, and it's on the CCB website. When you log on, it's right on the top left corner. There's a PDF page that describes specifically what you should and should not include in your CCV. So it's a helpful resource for anyone.
Okay, thanks. We have a new question down front here.
Sven Achenbach from engineering. I've got a question regarding the title of the proposal, and I'm not sure how really important that is. And this is in the context of the discoveries representing a program of research rather than projects, right? So with the long-term goals, I assume this is basically spending your career, so will just very little change over time, whereas of course the short-term objectives will strongly change from application to application. So I wonder what consideration should be given to the title, and is it good to reflect that you have got a consistent program by hardly or not at all changing the title? I've always wondered that. Or should there be a substantial change of the title from more or less reflecting the short-term goals? And another very brief sub-question is I'm also never really so sure how much time to spend coming up with some of the numbers associated in the CCV with how much time you spent on the bazillion grants you had before, right? Because for me that's always horrible to come up with number of hours. Do they have to add up to 24 hours a day, or do I include the nights? Does anybody even look at time spent for different grants proposals? And I'm not really sure whether the new proposal also requests to state how many hours you spent you plan to spend on it. So title, yep, and time spent.
Okay, good questions. I think on the title, this came up earlier from the panel. Patrick, I think, raised this. You want to be strategic with your letter of intent or your notice of intent, in that the co-chair in your group is going to be asking members, well, everyone is going to be rating their comfort in evaluating your grant. Everyone in the evaluation group is going through all these names and titles from the NOIs. And so your title needs to be informative enough, and as I think Patrick was saying, wanting to get it in a way that helps people go, yeah, I should be a reviewer on this. I'm comfortable with this material. Now, there's nothing stopping you from changing your title, I think, at the application stage. Nor is there any expectation of memory in the system that your title should be consistent with what you said 5 years ago. But I'll stand to be corrected on this. Go ahead, Patrick.
I can comment on the title because I actually did the same thing twice over the past 25 years, where I really significantly switched where I was going because of where the data took me. So I thought long and hard about title changes, and I always tried to make it something where it was a clear progression in the title change, where I was clearly, and would very, very clearly in the very first part of the grant indicate why I had essentially moved, or that was a natural progression to move from where I had gone previously into where I am now. So it became an obvious thing to do then, as opposed to just springing a completely different type of area and then not even talking about what I had talked about previously. So it still looks like it's part of your program switch, right? That it's a natural progression of where you've gone. I think that's kind of the best way to look at it. But you're right, there is no memory there that says 5 years ago they said this is what they would do. And I mean, as Ron has said, I mean, you can do anything you want, and that's the beauty of this system. You just have to be able to show that that switching what you did was a really good idea and that you've been productive doing it. And so if you change your title and you've got nothing to back it up, and you're in a completely different area now, and you really can't justify why you've done it, you'll have a hard time, right? So it really comes down more to what the proposal says. The second one about hours, I mean, I don't know what they're doing now. It's been a few years since I was on that, but I remember one year we had an applicant who, with all their grants, they didn't sleep. Basically, with the number of hours that were indicated on a monthly basis. I can tell you, at the committee level, we really didn't take hours very seriously because it's all over the map. And I don't know if NSERC has tried to make this more consistent now. But it's very, very subjective as to how people put that number down.
That is changing, though. I wanted to bring that up, that this year in particular, I know we actually encountered this exact problem where we had people with 4 and 5 different grants. It added up to something like 120 hours a week or 130 hours a week. It's just not I mean, it's ridiculous. So be honest. I mean, I think in 1501, we'd like to see something in the area. If you've got a grant, you're spending 20 to 30 hours a week because you've got other grants and other duties. That's kind of, you know, what we were looking at. But we actually sunk some grants on feasibility because when you added it all up, their important and critical NSERC program was 2 hours a week. So it comes along, it's essentially a question of feasibility. So if you're going to have a program, it better be more than 2 hours a week, right? So it is something we're looking at, clearly.
Yeah, just a quick point. Interesting you'd raise title because you would assume it has no bearing, but it really does. That's what everyone is going to look at when they say, yes, I'll review this. No, I for sure won't review this application. So the title is really important. I didn't realize that until I sat through this. About hours, we didn't look at the hours of grants, but if you have a research philosophy that sounds really great, that I nurture these students, I work really close to them, and I get them going, and I spend 2 hours a week with each of my students, and then I have 20 students, well, suddenly the feasibility becomes a problem. And then it's important what's in the grant. I had a review of a grant this year which had the same title for 3 years, 3 cycles running, and it almost began to feel like this work was already done based on what was written, so then you get into problems there. So I don't think the title alone is the problem, but what's in the proposal that starts to ask the questions about the title.
Can I just add a comment on the title too, Sven? Title's a really weird one. You got to keep in mind the panelists are all human. So you're 15 proposals in, and you're about to read another title that sounds exactly the same as the previous 15. Your mind goes numb before you even picked up the paper. So a title with a little bit of flair, a little bit of panache can be rewarding, right? It does sort of shake up the reviewer a little bit, and you sort of get refreshed. But you have to be careful, right? I would say that's a double-edged sword because if it's obvious BS, if it's just hyperbole and it's just a bunch of buzzwords and that comes through very quickly, then it'll have a very negative impact. I'm speaking from personal experience. I wouldn't say that's necessarily 100% reflective of all panelists. But yeah, and then the other thing is when you go back, right, especially on the RTIs, and you have to do that forced ranking. So you do an initial triage and you kind of put your proposals in a number that you know you're going to tweak. You're working off the spreadsheet, and the only thing that you have on the spreadsheet is the name of the applicant and the title, right? So the title, if it's, oh yeah, that was that really cool title, right? Again, it's pretty subtle, it's subjectivity, but you're putting the reviewer in maybe a more positive light if you do it correctly.
New question down here.
Yeah, I'm from engineering, so I have a few questions. One thing is about RTI. So I don't know what the changes that's happened for the last 2 years. So the last one I applied was 2 years ago. So it looks that the committee changed, right? So that's the whole engineering, only one committee or not? So that's the first question. Another questions about the HQP. That's a co-supervisor. I don't know if you might understand something different. If you are the main supervisor, the principal one, usually when we co-supervise one student, that's one is the principal supervisor. In this case, we just call it supervisor. The other one may be called co-supervisor or not, I don't know, not sure. Another thing is about the graduate student, that's for the HQP, the graduate time. So we have the time for defense, time for the graduation, that's get the degree. So if we go back to 6 years, which one is the time which one is the best one? Another thing is about the common CV. So previous CV from 100, we have the page limit. So I think that's good. I just put the most important things, the activities in my CV. But right now, that's CCV, no limitation at all. Should I put all the research activities inside it or not? In my own sense, when I review the others, I just want it to be shorter, not longer. So then when I put my CCV, I just thought about that. Should I put longer one or shorter one? So in my own opinion, I just want to put the most shortest one, the most important activities that's important. So thank you.
Yeah, if you give us too many questions, we might not have enough time to answer them. Feel free to jump in. I think on your question, the first question, was that about RTI engineering? Yeah. So I don't know, Ildiko, maybe you want to respond? Or?
From Ottawa?
Sure. Is there only the one?
The system, how it changed.
Sure. Is there some, do you have some knowledge on RTI engineering committee? Is there just the one? Has that changed since the last 2 years?
There is just the one committee, so it's 1609, and it encompasses all 4 of the engineering disciplines. They're kind of, the way in which the applications are divided, they fall into the 4 streams of engineering, but there is just the one committee. And then I guess I don't know if that answers the question.
Sure, for now.
I guess the second question was about HPP co-supervisors. We were asking how specifically to put it within the CCV.
Right, I think her question had to do with, so often there's a primary and then a secondary co-supervisor. If one should be noting that or not noting that.
I think you can just be honest with it. You're co-supervising, it's the same header, but when you're actually writing, you'll want to be explicit as to that you are either the primary or the co-supervisor, but as mentioned, both of the contributions are important. It's just a matter of specifying how specifically you will be, how your role as a supervisor works out. And I guess the third one was the timestamp for the date, convocation or when they actually complete all the requirements. I think there's no standard way of putting it in. I would maybe suggest talking to colleagues to see how they've put them in the past, but
just as long as you're clear about what that date means, then that's fine.
I think Ildiko, you had a comment?
Yeah, I just had a comment on the HQP co-supervision in the RTI context that it was positively viewed when they had co-supervision members of the applicants who co-applied for a grant, and they also had co-supervision of HQP. That was positively viewed.
Okay, thank you. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm just going to quickly get a couple more questions in here.
This is Shafiq Alam from engineering, and my research is on materials and chemical engineering, so it's good to see Caroline there in Ottawa. Hi. Well, my question is on external reviewer. When 5 members in the committee make an overall decision, how they weight or how they consider the external reviewers' ratings on overall decision? Because, for example, if I choose someone who is knowledgeable in my area from outside Canada, he might not be familiar with NSERC program, and does it mean I'm right?
Sure. I'll just make a quick comment on that. I know in the years I was on the committee, we were instructed as evaluation group members to read the grant on our own abilities first. Unlike a journal article submission where an editor is heavily reliant on those external reviews, please keep in mind that in Ottawa, you might have at competition week 5 external reviews, 0 external reviews, or some number in between. And it's really important that the evaluation group members are calibrated in a way that isn't going to get biased by particular external reviews. So I think that might still be the case, that they are instructed to, first and foremost, read the grants as evaluation group members. Those reviews, when they come in, if they come in, are often quite late in the whole process, into February, and sometimes coming in printed form the day of at competition. So one can't really weight them in any particular way, given that there's quite a bit of variability in the return rate itself. Other comments?
I mean, I can just come back to that because I think I opened that can of worms a little bit. So, I mean, you get every variety of type of review. You get some that are just a few sentences for every category and virtually say nothing. So it's a waste of time, that one. And we try to flag those types of reviews so that they won't necessarily be approached in the future to provide a review because they were not helpful. And then you get others that are exceptionally detailed and go through the grant in great detail. So definitely that's something that gets read, and then it's just like any other committee, it's subjectively looked at. It's brought back into discussion if it's appropriate, and it may or may not carry a lot of weight. It all depends on everyone's viewpoint over time. And I don't know what the average was this year, but it did seem, at least on 1501, we got a lot more external reviews in this year than in the past. But some of them are really good, and they certainly are discussed if it adds anything to the evaluation, and others are just ignored in terms of, and if there is something that gets a little personal, and that can happen, that also gets flagged.
Yeah.
And a response can go to the applicant that says the committee did not take this into account. And that's done because occasionally you get something that's just off the wall, that just isn't appropriate.
Indeed. I think on that note too, if you've applied unsuccessfully to NSERC, you've got comments from the committee, you've got comments from external reviewers. I think you want to treat the comments from the committee first and foremost. The external reviewers, you may not get the same external reviewers in another year. And as Daniel just said, there's a lot of things to consider on those external reviews. Was there another panelist who wanted to respond to that?
I was just going to say, in terms of the process, it's usually R1 that will present the summary of the external reviewers' comments to the rest of the committee. And I think, as Daniel said, it really depends. Sometimes they just get dismissed because they don't seem reasonable. They're either too positive, so it's obviously your best friend who wrote you a review that doesn't match the information in the application, so those tend to get dismissed. Or someone who doesn't like you for whatever reason is overly harsh, and that doesn't match the application. So those tend to get thrown out, and unfortunately we get a lot of those. So it just depends on what you get. When you get quality ones, they're taken into consideration.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take another new question here.
I'm Supratim Ghosh from Agriculture. My question is on RTI. So want to know that the comment we get from RTI committee is just the score and the rank. I mean, we don't know that how we did in different criteria. Is there any way to know that?
No.
Basically, no. Even the panelists, I had to email NSERC and say, hey, can I see how the applications that I read, how they were reviewed by the other 4 members? It's very difficult to get any feedback from NSERC on the RTI process.
Because you basically just send in your scores and that's it. No comments to send in.
We're running low on time, so I'll maybe take one more new question, and then I think we have a panelist who wants to comment on something else. New question. I know you have an old question, so we'll make our way up there.
I just have I am Yongfeng Ai from College of Agriculture. Just a question about the availability of the instrument. Because I started 4 months ago at the U of S, and I haven't decided if I really want to buy the instrument that is required for the proposed research. Will it make a difference, like I state in the proposal? The instrument has been purchased and is ready to go, or I will purchase it in the future. Is there any difference between that? And a second quick question is, when I was a postdoc, I worked with a technician for 1 year, and basically I trained her to get used to all the method we can use for different analysis in the lab. Will that count as a HQP training? Yep, thank you.
I guess I can answer the second question first. Definitely your training of the HQP when you were a postdoc, that would be very valuable. That would look very strong on the RTI. If you were asking for a piece of equipment, it was the same type of equipment that you used to train somebody, bring that into the RTI application for sure. That checks a couple of boxes if you go and look at the rating form. And then I'm not sure I understood your first question. You're going to buy the equipment and then ask NSERC to pay for it?
No, just will that also show that I'm eligible to, or I'm qualified to do the research? I'm not asking for money from NSERC, but just if I will buy the equipment, or I will buy it, will
I think, again, it's wordsmithing. If you phrase it correctly and you sort of say, look, this is an important piece of equipment, and my confidence in using this equipment is so high that I've already purchased it with startup funding, and now I need another piece of equipment X, right? So that would definitely make me, if I was reading this, think, well, yes, this is a person who's able to use the equipment and is quite confident in doing so. So you have to phrase it correctly, though. It's all wordsmithing.
Yeah, I would caution that if you said you're not applying for the discovery grant in this case, or how is this? I wasn't quite sure, again, how you worded this. Yeah, so if you have other funding and it's obvious in your CV you might be able to get it with that other funding, that's a good thing. But if you don't, if I was reviewing that and I saw that maybe this is your only grant and you're saying you need that piece of equipment, a lot of questions would arise like, why are you not applying for an RTI? So you definitely have to be careful how you word that, as Ian was saying.
Maybe before I take any more questions, given that we're going way over time, but this is good. We have one panelist who'd like to speak a little bit regarding leaves and I think particular types of leaves.
There's a question back there, so while you're walking, I'll just quickly address that if you, it just hasn't been mentioned yet, but if you've taken a medical leave or a parental leave, that there's a place in the Discovery Grant to actually report on these and how those are treated by the committee, at least in 1507, the one that I'm on. It was brought up by every program officer every time there was a leave reported in a positive way to say, did you actually consider that the work was done in spite of this leave? So when you're considering how you might want to report your leaves, if you've had a parental leave or a sick leave, just maybe talk to your research facilitator or your evaluation group about how those are treated within that group, because you also do have the opportunity, at least with parental leaves, to extend by a year per leave. So that's something that you may want to consider as well.
Okay, thanks. So we'll take one last question over here before we go into breakout groups.
Can I make one more comment about that?
Go ahead.
The contributions are explaining delays in research. It's now also sort of harmonized across the HQP training as well, so that if you have delays in research for publication or people defending because they took maternity leave or parental leave, that can also be an acceptable delay in research. So that can also be included.
And then just on the maternity leave, there's also a new maternity leave policy that just came out for individuals that are eligible to take it but haven't. It would take me a little bit too long to explain it, but it is on our website. So there is new leave. So if you've taken a parental leave within the span of your Discovery Grant, you might be eligible for an additional year of funding.
Thank you, Carolyn. One more question out here.
Yep, my name is Aaron White. I'm a researcher at the Vaccine Infectious Disease Organization. My question's really, my research is sort of on the cusp between NSERC and CIHR. I used to be firmly in NSERC, but because of recent discoveries, it's really pushing towards health. So a lot of the impacts that I would talk about are health related. So I'm wondering, should I steer clear of that and just stick to NSERC? In fact, my NOI at last year was flagged as possibly too health related. So I toned it down and made my objectives much more towards mechanisms, but still the impacts are there in the health side of things.
We've talked a little bit about this, and I guess I'll just say again, it's a very tight rope to balance between one's health and one's NSC work. And I think there are ways that one, as I mentioned earlier, might be able to talk about a particular patient type as providing a very unique test of basic mechanism, of basic function. But that is also with the cautionary notes that you've been hearing from the panelists on, you might be better off actually thinking of, you have a CIHR fundable set of programs of research, and you've got your NSE programs of research. I think there are a lot of successful people across Canada that plan to and try to get funding from both agencies on that. Anyone want to add to this discussion? Patrick?
Yeah, I mean, the ones that have been the most successful, I think, that had both CIHR and NSERC funding are the ones that are really, really explicit about the separation of things when it comes to different programs. And that even comes down to the publications. Someone who has acknowledged NSERC and CIHR on every paper, right? The committee's going to look at that and say, well, how are these separate? How are these different, right? I mean, I don't see the difference. So it's thinking about it, long term, right? how you're going to separate those out and clearly show. I mean, and they expect them to be intertwined in some respect. I mean, they're going to feed off of each other, but there still has to be a really distinct separation of them. And the ones that have been most successful are the ones who do that very, very well. And the ones that aren't successful are usually the ones that the committee's left wondering kind of where the line is between the two.
Okay. Any other comments? Go ahead, Carrie and Adil.
Just one quick thing. If you look at the rating form, it says directly in there, quality of contributions to and impact on research areas in the NSC. So I know you want to bring in those health impacts and they're important, but it does say specifically here the impacts on NSC. So I mean, you need to include them, but don't rely on them.
Adil?
I was just going to say the same thing. I think if as soon as you mention the word health or disease, it's really not going to help you. So you really want to stay away from that.
Well, conscious of the time, I think what I'll suggest, folks, is that we were planning breakout groups to have additional discussion and strategies. This has been a very good Q&A session, though. Please join me in thanking the panelists and our program officers from Ottawa. Thank you, folks, everyone, for your contributions today. And then I'll have something else to say, but please.